Imagine a vast ribbon of land stretching from the Danube to the Altai, a sea of grass broken only by river corridors and the occasional stand of birch and willow. The wind on that wide plain is not an abstract sound but a constant companion, shaping not just the grass but the lives of the people who learn to move with it. To understand the origins of the Scythians, begin here, on this steppe where mobility was survival, where horses and herds dictated the rhythm of existence, and where 1,000 small decisions over generations produced a new way of life. This is a story of landscape and adaptation, of culture and technology, of interaction and transformation across centuries. Archaeologists and historians often start with a scatter of mounds, the kurgans that dot the steppe like punctuation marks. Kurgans are burial mounds, sometimes modest and sometimes monumental, stacking generations of memory and prestige into earthen cones. In their shafts and chambers, beneath layers of wood and soil, lie the remains of people and horses, weapons, ornaments, and sometimes textiles preserved by cold or aridity. These graves tell a story of a people who valued mobility but also invested in monumental expressions of status and memory, combining the temporary tent with the enduring mound. Long before anyone called them Scythians, the ancestors of steppe nomads were part of a shifting tapestry of cultures in the later Neolithic and early Bronze Age. We can trace threads to communities practicing early pastoralism, perhaps as early as the 4th millennium BCE, when people across the Eurasian plain began to manage sheep and cattle and to exploit horses in ways that changed mobility and warfare. The Yamnaya horizon, emerging around 3300 to 2600 BCE, is often signaled as a major ancestral strand. Pastoralists who moved seasonally, buried their dead in kurgans, and spread technologies and genes across large distances. Those movements created ecological and cultural templates that later groups would inherit, adapt, and elaborate. From the broad sweep of the Bronze Age emerges a more recognizably Scythian pattern in the 1st millennium BCE, but the transformation was gradual and multifaceted. It was driven not by a single migration or a single innovation, but by a series of developments in metallurgy, horse gear, social organization, and interaction with neighboring sedentary peoples. As groups moved and mixed across the steppe, local traditions intertwined with new practices, producing regional variations that scholars would later name Scythian, Saka, Masajte, and more. These names are ancient exonyms from Greek and Persian sources, handy labels for modern historians, but they mask a complex web of connected and distinct communities. One of the most consequential technological changes was the mastery of mounted warfare and the development of the composite bow. Riding required a reconfiguration of settlement patterns and tactics, because mounted fighters could cover enormous distances quickly, scout effectively, and strike with a mobility that chariots could not match. The composite bow, made from layers of wood, horn, and sinew, offered a powerful, compact weapon that could be used effectively from horseback. Together, horse and bow reshaped the calculus of power on the steppe, enabling small, highly mobile bands to dominate larger, less agile forces. Material culture offers another lens into origins. The Scythians became famous for a distinctive artistic vocabulary known as animal style, where predators and hybrid creatures are rendered with tense lines and dynamic posture. These images appear on gold plaques, belt buckles, horse gear, and weaponry, and they are not mere decoration, they express cosmologies, social identities, and prestige. Comparing motifs across regions reveals how ideas flowed along steppe networks, with local artisans adapting shared visual language to local tastes and materials. The presence of exquisite goldwork suggests craft specialization and long-distance connections to metal sources and specialized workshops. Burial practices themselves provide a complex narrative. Early kurgans were often simple, but as some individuals or families accrued wealth and status, tombs became elaborate. They might include wooden chambers, animal sacrifices, carts or chariots, and the bodies of attendants, sometimes ritually killed or buried alongside their lord. The scale of these tombs hints at social hierarchies, an elite able to command the labor and resources to build a monumental resting place, and communities organized to carry out complex funerary rites. These practices also carved memory into the landscape, creating territorial markers visible for generations. The steppe is not a blank expanse but a mosaic of rivers, wetlands, and wooded patches, and these ecological features shaped where communities settled, where they grazed stock, and where they moved in winter and summer. River valleys like the Don, Dnieper, Volga, and Ural provided water, pasture, and routes for seasonal migration, while also acting as conduits for trade and contact with agricultural societies. Neighboring farmers produced grain, pottery, and wine that nomads could access through trade or tribute, creating a symbiotic tension between mobility and sedentary production. This frontier dynamic fueled cultural exchanges and occasional conflicts, and it produced frontier economies that mixed mobility with attachment to particular landscapes. Linguistics offers a further thread, though it is a more tentative one. Many scholars place the Scythians within the broad family of Iranian languages, a conclusion drawn from names recorded by Greeks and Persians, and from linguistic reconstructions. This connection suggests that the ancestors of the Scythians likely spoke tongues related to Avestan or Old Iranian dialects, though not all steppe peoples fit neatly into linguistic categories. Language shifts can occur through elite dominance, blending, or migration, and linguistic evidence must be combined with archaeology and genetics for a fuller picture. Even so, the linguistic signal supports a view of steppe cultures that were part of a larger Eurasian world of Iranian-speaking elites and pastoral communities. Genetics has transformed our understanding of origins by allowing direct glimpses into the biological heritage of ancient people. Ancient DNA recovered from kurgans reveals a mosaic. Some individuals show continuity with earlier Western steppe herders, while others carry signals of admixture with Siberian or East Asian populations, especially in the eastern reaches of the steppe. This pattern fits a scenario in which a foundational gene pool associated with Yamnaya-like pastoralists spread across the steppe, then mixed with local groups and newcomers as time went on. The genetic complexity underscores that the emergence of the Scythians was not a singular event but an ongoing process of contact and fusion across vast distances. Stable isotope studies further refine the image by revealing diets and mobility patterns. Carbon and nitrogen isotopes in bones can indicate the balance of meat, milk, and plant foods, while strontium isotopes hint at geographic origins and lifetime movement. Some elite individuals show isotopic signatures consistent with diets rich in animal protein and perhaps imported foods, while others reflect more local, mixed diets. Strontium patterns show that while many people were local to their burial place, a significant minority were born elsewhere, testifying to a world where marriage, raiding, trade, and alliances moved people across the steppe. The archaeological record also shows continuity with earlier Bronze Age practices alongside innovations. Bronze weaponry and horse trappings gave way to iron tools and weapons as iron technology spread, and metallurgical skills adapted to produce lighter, more efficient gear for mounted use. Contacts with settled neighbors brought in new goods, from Greek wine to Near Eastern textiles, and these items were often repurposed into a steppe idiom. For example, Greek silver and pottery might be buried in Scythian tombs, serving both as prestige items and as evidence of the complex networks that linked the steppe to Mediterranean markets. Classical texts, especially Herodotus, provide vivid if partial narratives that shaped later perceptions of Scythians. Herodotus writes as a Greek visiting the margins of his own world, fascinated by nomads who seemed at once foreign and familiar. His accounts of tattoos, funerary rites, and bold horse archers capture imaginations but must be read critically. Travelers embellish, misunderstand, and sometimes conflate different groups. Yet his writings echo a central truth from the archaeological record. Scythian societies were distinctive, highly mobile, martial, and deeply engaged with their neighbors in ways that left lasting impressions on the literate world to their south and west. One striking aspect of Scythian society was the role of women, which appears in both myth and material evidence. Grave finds reveal women buried with weapons and warrior accoutrements, while literary sources speak of warrior women among related peoples like the Sarmatians. Whether these women fought as a widespread norm or represented a small elite is debated, but their presence in the archaeological record complicates modern assumptions about gender roles in ancient pastoral societies. In any case, women could hold high status, manage herds, and sometimes command power, illustrating the fluidity of steppe social arrangements. Trade routes were arteries of exchange that linked the Scythians to distant lands, carrying goods, ideas, and people. The northern Black Sea acted as a focal point for contact with Greek colonies such as Olbia, Panticapaeum, and Sinope, which traded pottery, metal goods, and wine for steppe horses, hides, and slaves. These interactions created a cross-cultural marketplace where Greek artisans adopted Scythian motifs and Scythian elites adopted items of Greek luxury, blending tastes and creating hybrid material culture. Through trade, Scythians were neither isolated barbarians nor mere recipients of civilization, but active participants in trans-regional exchange. Political organization among Scythians was variable and adaptive, often centered around powerful chieftains or royal houses who could mobilize followers for raids, defense, or ceremonial displays. Several ancient sources speak of Scythian kings who wielded authority over far-flung tribes, but that power was rarely absolute. It depended on personal loyalty, warband allegiance, and reputation. Leadership combined martial skill with ritual authority. Burying a powerful leader in a monumental kurgan reinforced both his earthly power and his role in the metaphysical order. Political power on the steppe was thus both pragmatic and symbolic, requiring constant performance and alliance building. One must also consider how climate and environment influenced movements and transformations. Periodic fluctuations in rainfall and temperature could alter pasture quality, forcing herders to adjust migration patterns or to move into new territories. Multi-century shifts could make some regions less hospitable and others more attractive, prompting migrations and competition. These ecological pressures did not act alone, but together with technological innovations, demographic changes, and external pressures from expanding neighboring states to shape the contours of Scythian emergence. The archaeological record in the Altai offers an extraordinary window into the lives of steppe people, thanks to permafrost that preserved organic materials with uncanny fidelity. The Pazyryk tombs of Siberia revealed felt rugs, finely woven textiles, lacquered wooden saddles, and human bodies with detailed tattoos depicting animal combat scenes. These artifacts are not just treasures but documents of daily life, fashion, and belief, showing how artisans exploited local resources and long-distance techniques to produce objects of striking beauty. Such finds remind us that Scythian culture was materially rich and artistically sophisticated, as much about lived aesthetics as about warfare. Differences between Western and Eastern Scythians reveal the heterogeneity of steppe cultures. In the Western Pontic steppe, Scythians interacted extensively with Greek cities and European tribes, producing a material culture infused with Mediterranean elements. Farther east, in the Kazakh and Altai regions, Scythian-related groups like the Saka interacted with different neighbors, absorbing Siberian influences and participating in transcontinental networks that reached into China and Central Asia. These regional variations show that Scythian identity was not monolithic. It was a flexible umbrella under which diverse groups could find common ground while maintaining local customs. Religious and cosmological beliefs among the Scythians are glimpsed through burial goods, ritual deposits, and Greek descriptions of Scythian sacred practices. Objects placed in tombs point to a concern with the afterlife and with maintaining relationships between the living and the dead. Animal motifs, often showing dynamic struggles between predators and prey, may reflect mythic narratives about power, protection, and the precariousness of life on the steppe. Ritual specialists likely mediated these beliefs, performing ceremonies that knitted communities together and justified elite authority. The steppe was also a zone of linguistic and cultural diffusion, where words, goods, and practices moved with surprising speed. Horse terminology, metalworking vocabulary, and ritual formulas could spread along the same routes that moved cattle and warriors, altering speech across vast distances. This mobility created linguistic layering, where a single valley might hear multiple tongues over a generation, and where personal names recorded by outsiders reveal an intertwined set of influences. The Scythians were thus participants in a dynamic linguistic frontier, not static speakers of a single unchanging language. The relationship between Scythians and neighboring empires was both confrontational and cooperative. Persian rulers like Darius encountered Scythian groups during campaigns, adjusting tactics to face highly mobile mounted archers. Greek colonies negotiated alliances, fought wars, and exchanged gifts with steppe elites, sometimes adopting Scythian mercenaries or partnering in cross-border commerce. These relationships demonstrate that steppe societies could be pragmatic partners in regional geopolitics, leveraging their strengths while absorbing influences from powerful neighbors. Artifacts like the famed Scythian gold plaques speak to specialized craftsmanship and to access to precious materials. Gold was worked into thin, delicate sheets, punched and embossed with animal motifs, creating dazzling displays of wealth that would have been visible at ceremonial gatherings. Such objects were portable prestige, ideal for a mobile elite whose wealth had to move with them across the pasture. The presence of these items in both Western and Eastern contexts suggests shared values around display and the social uses of luxury. Scythian weaponry evolved with social and tactical needs. Early daggers and spears gave way to short swords and saber-like blades optimized for slashing from horseback, while bows and arrowheads were designed for piercing at range. Horse harnesses became more sophisticated, with bits, cheek pieces, and decorative fittings that both improved control and signaled status. Weaponry was not only functional but emblematic. A finely decorated bow or a gold-adorned scabbard marked a rider as a person of command. Subsistence on the steppe was a balancing act between herding, hunting, and opportunistic agriculture or tribute from sedentary neighbors. Herds provided meat, milk, hides, and transport, but they also required constant movement to access fresh pasture. Hunting supplemented diets and offered material for ritual and art, especially in the form of furs and bones. In some river valleys, steppe peoples cultivated small plots or acquired grain through exchange, combining mobility with periodic attachments to place. The very notion of territory among Scythian groups was different from that of sedentary agricultural states. Territories were often flexible, based on seasonal use rights, pasture rotation, and negotiated access to watering places. Kurgans and other landmarks served as durable claims that anchored ephemeral migrations to specific places, creating a layered map of memory and authority. This system allowed for a degree of coexistence with neighboring farmers, while also creating flashpoints where interests collided over pasture or access to resources. Ethnogenesis, the process by which groups form a shared identity, was slow and cumulative on the steppe. Scythian identity emerged from a confluence of ancestry, shared technology, ritual practice, and economic patterns, not from a single founding moment. As bands adopted similar horse gear, burial rites, and artistic motifs, they found in those practices the seeds of a common identity that could be invoked across generations. This formation was inherently flexible, allowing local variation within a broader cultural horizon. The role of nomadic elites in shaping cultural diffusion cannot be overstated. Elite riders orchestrated raids, controlled trade routes, and acted as cultural brokers, bringing exotic goods and ideas back to their communities. Their tombs, with rich grave goods, broadcast a material language that others emulated or competed with. Elite rivalry, therefore, was a motor of innovation as much as a driver of conflict, spurring the creation of ever more elaborate displays of power and taste. Seasonal cycles structured social life in predictable rhythms. Spring and autumn migrations involved packing wagons, breaking down felt tents, and moving flocks to greener pastures. These migrations were not chaotic exoduses but coordinated operations requiring intimate knowledge of the landscape and social cooperation. The rituals surrounding departure and return likely reinforced social bonds and affirmed the authority of leaders who organized these communal efforts. Conflict and diplomacy on the steppe often blended in ways that differ from modern dichotomies. Raiding could be a strategy of extraction and prestige, but it also opened channels for negotiations, marriages, and trade agreements. A successful raid might enhance a chieftain's reputation, making him a more attractive ally in peacetime, while gift exchanges could cement political ties. This blending of violence and diplomacy shaped the fluid allegiances that characterized steppe politics. The diffusion of iron technology was a watershed for steppe societies, enabling lighter tools, sharper weapons, and more efficient horse gear. Iron smelting and smithing spread through networks of knowledge that crossed cultural frontiers, with itinerant craftsmen and mobile smithies helping to disseminate techniques. Once iron tools became widespread, they supported a wider range of economic activities and further enhanced the effectiveness of mounted warriors. Artisan production included specialists who traveled or settled temporarily near resource-rich sites, producing luxury goods for elites. Metalworkers, leatherworkers, and textile specialists used local materials and imported techniques to create objects that were both functional and symbolic. Their work involved sophisticated knowledge of alloys, tanning, and weaving, and it required collaboration between nomadic patrons and artisans who could supply high-status items. These artisans were crucial nodes in a network that connected steppe patrons with the wider world of material culture. Monuments like kurgans had a performative role, staging the politics of memory and authority. Building a kurgan asserted a family's claim to lineage and past achievements, while the placement of grave goods told stories about relationships, values, and cosmology. Over time, clusters of kurgans could form long-term landscapes of power, visible to friend and foe alike and serving as a spatial archive of social order. This interplay of memory and landscape anchored ephemeral pastoral life in a long view of ancestry. The presence of diverse burial practices across the steppe reflects social and regional diversity. Some tombs were simple and unadorned, while others included elaborate wooden chambers, carts, and sacrificial victims. Differences may reflect wealth disparity, local tradition, or differing beliefs about the afterlife, but they also reveal how groups constructed identities through ritual choices. By studying variation in burial practices, researchers reconstruct social worlds that no longer speak for themselves, translating material choices into human stories. Scythian funerary feasts and sacrifices were public events that reinforced social ties and enacted cosmological orders. The act of burying a leader with attendants and horses was not simply disposal but a performance in which the community participated, acknowledging debts, obligations, and relationships. Sacrificial rituals could also redistribute goods and bind people to the leader's memory, as surviving relatives and retainers took on new roles within the social order. These rituals made death a social instrument for continuity rather than solely an end. The movement of peoples across the steppe influenced and was influenced by adjacent zones, creating ripple effects through Eurasia. When steppe groups moved westward, they pressed on the borders of European societies, sometimes catalyzing migrations, sometimes integrating into local polities. To the east, steppe mobility intersected with emerging powers in Central Asia and China, with nomadic groups alternating between confrontation and cooperation with imperial states. The steppe was therefore not a peripheral backwater but a dynamic arena that shaped broader Eurasian history. The Greek colonies along the Black Sea are invaluable to our understanding because they recorded names, customs, and events that archaeologists can compare to material evidence. Inscriptions, coinage, and pottery found in colonial towns provide datable contexts for Scythian material and reveal reciprocal influences. The Greek written record colors our image of Scythians, sometimes painting them as exotic other, but when balanced with archaeological data, it gives texture to a world where oral and material cultures intersected with literacy. In the eastern steppe, contact with nomadic groups further transformed local societies and created new hybrid cultures. The Saka and other eastern Scythian groups adapted shared elements like mounted archery but combined them with local traditions in dress, burial, and language. These eastern adaptations also show the reach of steppe networks, with goods and motifs traveling along routes that linked the Altai to the Iranian plateau and beyond. Over time, these connections contributed to a continuum of nomadic cultures stretching across Eurasia. The story of Scythian origins must include the continuum between pastoral nomadism and sedentary life, where many families combined herding with small-scale agriculture or permanent settlements. Not every individual lived in a felt tent. Some families maintained semi-permanent bases near riverine meadows or traded seasonally to urban centers. This blended economy allowed flexibility in times of environmental stress and facilitated deeper engagement with local markets and political authorities. It also complicates the stereotype of the purely mobile nomad and reminds us that ancient lives were pragmatically diverse. Warfare on the steppe required logistics and knowledge of terrain, but it also relied heavily on reputation and leadership. A warband's success depended on cohesive command, supply lines for horses, and intelligence about enemy movements. Leaders who excelled as strategists and ritual figures could maintain coalitions, while those who failed found their reputations, and thus their influence, eroded. Thus, military prowess and ritual legitimacy were intertwined in sustaining authority on the steppe. Trade in horses and horse culture itself was central to the steppe economy. Scythian horses were prized not only for warfare but also as a commodity. Stallions and mares moved across borders, sold or gifted in diplomatic exchanges, and sometimes traded for luxury goods. This horse economy reinforced social hierarchies, as ownership of large herds signified wealth and power, and as horsemanship skills were essential for prestige. The horse, in many ways, was both tool and symbol of the nomadic world. Technological adaptations to the environment included the use of felt for tents and clothing, which provided insulation and were easily portable. Felt production required knowledge of textile manufacture and animal husbandry, producing durable housing and garments suited to the extremes of steppe climate. Such materials also had symbolic forms, with patterns and colors signaling group identity or status, transforming practical objects into identifiers of belonging. Ritual objects found in tombs, masks, drinking vessels, and decorated implements suggest a ceremonial life that went beyond survival. Drinking rituals, possibly involving fermented mare's milk or imported wine, created communal bonds and enacted social hierarchies. The materiality of these ceremonies, the vessels, the seating arrangements, the placement of objects, was part of a performance that conveyed unspoken codes of loyalty and rank. These ceremonies were the glue of social life, making alliances visible and obligations enforceable. The role of slavery and captive economies in Scythian society introduces a darker dimension to pastoral life. Raids and warfare produced captives who could be integrated into households, sold to foreign markets, or sacrificed in funerary rites. The presence of human remains sometimes associated with burials suggests that captives could be compelled into grim roles in the afterlife of elites. This reality underscores the human costs of steppe politics, where mobility and power often had violent consequences. Scythian names preserved in Greek and Persian sources offer clues about linguistic affiliations and personal identity. Names of kings, tribes, and places, when stripped of later accretions, often show Iranian roots, reflecting the broader ethno-linguistic context of many steppe groups. Yet names are porous. Trade, marriage, and captive exchanges broadened foreign appellations, leaving a mixed tapestry of nomenclature. Names are, therefore, one thread among many that help reconstruct a mosaic of identity. As the centuries progressed, Scythian polities transformed in response to internal dynamics and external pressures, eventually giving way to Sarmatian dominance in some regions and to new nomadic confederations in others. These transitions were not sudden collapses but processes of assimilation, conflict, and realignment as groups adopted new technologies, shifted alliances, and moved into new landscapes. Even as Scythian dominance waned in places, their cultural traces persisted in art, burial practices, and the social memory of neighboring states. Modern archaeology continues to revise and refine the story, employing new methods and interdisciplinary collaboration. Radiocarbon dating provides chronological anchors, while ADNA unravels ancestry, and isotopic studies reveal diets and mobility. Remote sensing and GIS mapping allow researchers to model pasture availability and migration routes, bringing ecological nuance to historical narratives. This methodological pluralism underscores that the question of origins is answerable not by a single method, but by a chorus of scientific and interpretive voices. Interpretive debates remain lively. Scholars argue about the degree to which Scythian culture emerged through migration versus local innovation, about the relationship between material culture and language, and about how to read literary sources against material evidence. These debates are not mere academic quibbling, they shape our understanding of how identities form and how cultures change in the absence of state bureaucracy. What is clear is that the Scythians were products of both continuity and change, inheritors of Bronze Age legacies and innovators in their own right. The legacy of the Scythians reaches beyond museums and texts into the imagination of later peoples, who mythologized them as archetypal horse archers of the steppe. For Greeks and later Europeans, Scythians became a trope, a mirror in which sedentary societies could see traits they admired or feared, mobility, martial prowess, and a direct relationship to the natural world. This legacy helped shape narratives about the steppe that resonated through medieval chronicles and into modern historiography, even as new evidence complicates older stereotypes. In reconstructing origins, we must remain attentive to the limits of the evidence and to the spectral gaps where human lives go unrecorded. Kurgans speak loudly because they preserve exceptional events, the elite burial, the meticulously prepared tomb. Ordinary lives, women who tended flocks, children who learned to ride, craftsmen who worked in the shade of a wagon, leave fainter traces. Yet by piecing together diverse datasets, we can begin to imagine those lives with humane specificity, recognizing that origins are lived not only by elites but by whole communities. The Scythians remind us that culture is mobile and contested, that identities form in motion as much as in place. As riders crossed the plain, their belongings carried stories and their graves enshrined reputations, creating a culture that was outward-looking and internally cohesive. The steppe encouraged adaptability. A successful group could absorb newcomers, try new tactics, and reconfigure alliances in ways that preserved core practices while changing details. In this elasticity lies one key to their endurance and to their impact on Eurasian history. Ultimately, the origins of the Scythians are a story of human creativity in a demanding environment, where horses, bronze, and gold met with wind and grass to produce a distinctive way of living. They were neither brutish nomads nor exotic outliers, but complex societies whose innovations in mobility, art, and social organization influenced a broad sweep of Eurasia. By reading Kurgans, decoding ancient DNA, and listening to the echoes of classical writers, we piece together a layered tale of emergence, adaptation, and enduring cultural resonance. Contemporary researchers continue to uncover new fragments that refine the picture, from remote cemetery surveys to isolated textile finds, each adding texture and nuance. Sometimes the most mundane discovery, a fragment of horse harness or a single bead, appends assumptions by showing trade routes were different, or that a particular motif spread earlier than believed. The cumulative effect of such finds is to reveal a past that was more interconnected and more dynamic than any single narrative could capture. The story of origins is therefore always provisional, an evolving map of evidence and interpretation. To listen to the past is to listen for multiple voices, the chieftain issuing commands at dawn, the artisan hammering thin gold sheets by lamplight, the shepherd guiding a herd across a river ford, the woman who embroidered a garment with an animal motif carried for centuries. Their lives overlapped, clashed, and harmonized, producing the cultural syncretism we call Scythian. It is this human chorus, sometimes discordant, sometimes unified, that animates the archaeological record and invites us into a continuously unfolding story of origin and identity. As modern borders cut across the steppe, the archaeology of Scythian origins becomes a transnational effort, with scholars from different countries collaborating and occasionally contesting interpretations. Museums in Kiev, Moscow, St. Petersburg, Almaty, and beyond hold artifacts that span the Scythian world, each object carrying both local provenance and broader significance. These collections remind us that the past transcends contemporary boundaries and that reconstructing origins requires dialogue across modern political divides. The Scythian past thus becomes a shared heritage, one that encourages cooperation in pursuit of knowledge. The Scythians were also agents of technological transfer, carrying innovations like mounted archery and composite bow technology across vast distances. Their practices influenced neighboring peoples, who adopted or adapted elements of steppe warfare, horsemanship, and material culture. Over generations, this diffusion reshaped military practices across Eurasia, altering the balance of power between nomads and settled states. Recognizing the Scythians as vectors of change highlights how mobility can be a powerful engine of innovation. Many misconceptions about Scythians persist in popular imagination, shaped by romantic or polemical narratives. The truth is more textured. Scythians were pragmatic, aesthetic, warlike in certain contexts, and deeply enmeshed in economic and ritual systems. They were creators of art, not merely consumers of foreign goods, and they navigated complex social worlds that defy simple labels. Bringing nuance to their story is crucial to honoring their real historical role rather than perpetuating caricatures. Future discoveries will no doubt complicate and enrich our understanding as new kurgans are excavated, as more genomes are sequenced, and as environmental reconstructions become more precise. Each new dataset will require rethinking old assumptions and weaving fresh threads into the tapestry of origins. The process is iterative and cumulative, a scholarly conversation that spans disciplines and decades, driven by curiosity and the desire to listen closely to fragments of the past. The origins of the Scythians, then, are not a closed book but an ongoing exploration, one that rewards patient attention to detail and willingness to synthesize diverse evidence. From the rhythm of seasonal migration to the luxury of gold plaques, from the clarity of genetic signals to the artistry of dyed textiles, the story emerges as a richly layered portrait. It is a story of place and movement, of individuals and collectives, of creative adaptation on a landscape that required both resilience and imagination. Above all, learning about Scythian origins invites us to expand our sense of what ancient societies could be, flexible, cosmopolitan in their own way, and capable of producing both grand monuments and intimate domestic arts. They remind us that human societies adapt creatively to constraints, turning environmental challenges into opportunities for new social forms. The steppe is the theater where such creativity was practiced at scale, and the Scythians are one of its most resonant expressions. If you find yourself thinking of them as distant figures, consider the immediacy of their world: children learning to ride from infancy, craftsmen perfecting alloys through trial and error, leaders negotiating alliances in smoky tents by candlelight. These are human scenes that echo across time, accessible to us through bones and ornaments, through the chemical traces of diet, and through the fragile scraps of textiles. It is through such everyday realities that the broad outlines of origins acquire human depth. And so the Scythian emergence is a mosaic composed of long-term pastoral traditions, technological innovations, ecological pressures, and sustained contact with neighboring peoples. Each element contributed to a distinctive cultural horizon that spanned continents and centuries, shaping the history of Eurasia in ways we are still deciphering. As research advances, that horizon comes into ever sharper focus, revealing not a monolithic people but a constellation of groups united by shared practices and diverse in local expression. The wind across the steppe is a language of its own, a long, low sentence that speaks of distance and weather and the slow movement of flocks. A Scythian waking to that wind learns it the way a child learns a mother's face, intimately, without conscious thought. Their lives unfold under an open sky, and everything they do bends to the logic of space: how far the grass stretches, where the water pools, which ridge will shield the camp from the cold northern gusts. In that vastness, simplicity is a kind of cunning. Possessions are chosen for usefulness, not for display, though wealth will find its way into ornament when the ground permits graves and goldsmiths to speak of glory. From the first light there is a choreography that feels like breathing. Horses are fed and stroked, their flanks still warm from night, and blankets are rolled or cast into the sun to air. Tents are collapsed rhythmically, like breathing out, poles slipping into wrappings, felt folded to keep heat and dust at bay for the long ride ahead. Men and women move through these motions as if they are practicing a shared memory, one that has been repeated for generations and refined in the telling, so that few words are necessary and many glances mean more than a speech. The horse is the center of a Scythian household and the pivot of its economy and warfare. These are not horses for leisurely riding. They are compact, hardy animals born for endurance, bred for speed across the steppe and for sure-footedness on the frozen tracks. To ride one is to become part of a machine that blends rider and mount, a conversation of leg and rein and breath that requires trust and frequent attention. The tack itself, bits, headpieces, the occasional felt pad, is minimal and practical. Every strap is tied with the intent of keeping a life and livelihood secure. Milk and meat shape everyday sustenance, but the tastes are far subtler than the idea of a bland pastoral diet suggests. Fermented mare's milk, sour-sweet and slightly effervescent, is a sustaining drink that can be both refreshment and mild preservative. Its tang slides across the tongue like a map of the winter and the summer pastures. Meat is often dried or smoked so it will travel well, and when a young foal is born there is ceremony and restraint around it because each new animal is a future rider or future meat, and their numbers determine futures and fortunes. Even in scarcity, the Scythian palate is inventive, fats are rendered, herbs are foraged, and whatever can be stored in skins and hides is carefully apportioned for long journeys. Clothing is both survival gear and a statement of identity, stitched from wool and leather and sometimes silk imported or traded through long chains that reach into the cities. Over coarse undergarments there are tunics cut for ease of movement, close to the body for warmth but with enough room to swing a bow, to mount quickly, to wrestle. Decorations appear where gold or bronze is available, not frivolously but as a sign of place in the world, a grander belt here, a gilded harness there, each ornament telling a neighbor something about rank and ability. Practicalities rule, but beauty is not absent. The animal style that decorates metalwork and horse trappings turns daily objects into small sacred narratives about power and life. To cross the steppe is to read soft signs, the height of the grass, the fresh droppings of other herds, the birds circling above a hidden waterhole. Camps are rarely permanent. They are chosen for pasture and water, positioned to allow swift movement if the seasons or enemies demand it. Knowledge of the land is not theoretical but tactile, accumulated through long journeys and the close reading of weather and soil. Knowing where a spring hides under a tuft of grass can save a camp, and the memory of that spring is passed down like a map stitched into the mind. This is a life where memory and movement are inseparable, where each generation adds small corrections to a route that has held for centuries. Children learn early to be light and quick, their games often indistinguishable from training. They ride before they walk long distances, balancing on backs that will one day carry them into raids and hunts. Toys are often scaled versions of adult life, bows strung with gut for practice, tiny felt houses to mimic packing and unpacking, little wooden horses to rehearse the balance and timing of a mounted life. Education is practical, conducted by seeing and doing. Stories are told around the fire to keep the attention of the young, but the real lessons are learned in the saddle and at the side of a flint and knife. The shelter of a Scythian is a lesson in portability and warmth. Felt blankets are thick and layered. When the wind rises, they are wrapped around shoulders and heads, creating an insulation that resists the chill sweeping over the plains. Poles and skin and felt fold into compact bundles that will be rectangular or oval depending on design, and the rhythm of setting camp down and lifting it up becomes a kind of music, punctuated by the soft thud of stakes and the rustle of fabric. Inside, smoke from the central hearth darkens the roof but keeps life snug, and animals might stand close by for shared warmth and the practicality of guarding livestock at night. People and animals share a tactile intimacy that settles into the daily routines, a hand smoothing a horse's flank, a child stealing a lamb from a pen, a woman stitching repairs by the light of a low fire. Tools are practical and well-worn, awls and bone needles, flint blades, and straps show years of use and are usually the trusted possessions a person will not part with. The simple act of repairing a shoe or readying a bridle is an act of care that keeps the whole community moving. It is the small maintenance of a life that makes large movements possible. There is a rhythm to these repairs that is almost meditative, a way of making order against the constant motion of nomadic life. Hunting is both necessity and technique, and it trains body and mind to read the land like a finely printed page. Drives and traps are organized with the same care as warfare, and a hunt will require the quick cooperation of riders and dogs and sometimes nets or pits concealed beneath the grasses. Success brings meat and hides, and also a measure of prestige. The stories told afterward stretch the reputation of the hunter across a winter's hearth. Even the unsuccessful hunts teach skill, patience, timing, and the physics of a bow and falling animal are all lessons that carry into other parts of life, especially into battle. The bow is the instrument that translates the restlessness of the steppe into a profound advantage. Compact and powerful, the composite bow favored by Scythians is constructed of wood, sinew, and horn, layered and glued, a miracle of tensile construction that stores energy in a small package. Riding and shooting are synchronized in a way that seems choreographed. A rider can twist, unseat himself, and fire while leaning back, releasing arrows that fly with a speed and arc few foot soldiers can match. This technique changes everything about combat. It makes mobility lethal and distance ambiguous, turning the wide openness of the steppe into an arena where a single rider can alter the fate of a skirmish. The maintenance of weapons and tools is an art whose daily attention is as important as the weapons themselves. Arrows are fletched with care, each feather balanced to spin true, and arrowheads are sharpened or reshaped as needed. Bowstrings must be replaced when they fray, sinew dried and twisted in specific humidity, and shafts straightened to true flight. A broken bow or a misshapen arrow can mean the difference between bringing down game and returning to camp empty-handed. Thus, these small acts of craftsmanship are quietly revered. Trade is the invisible current that knits the steppe to the settled world beyond. Scythians exchange furs, horses, and captive hands for metalwork, wine, grains, and luxury items that travel along river and caravan routes. These exchanges are not just economic but social, forming relations with merchants and city-states that are sometimes tense and sometimes amicable. Trade goods become statements. A foreign vessel can be adapted into a drinking cup and become part of a new ritual, while a bolt of cloth can signal a foothold in a wider network of influence. At the edge of the steppe, the Scythians encounter worlds that are anchored in stone and cities that do not move. These urban neighbors think in walls and storehouses, and permanent crops and written contracts, and their astonishment at the freedom of nomads produces myths and misunderstandings. Sometimes the encounters are violent, as raiding and reprisal curl through decades, but often they are pragmatic, shaped by treaties, tribute, and marriage alliances that blur the lines. It is not accurate to imagine the steppe as isolated. It is a corridor of exchange, strategically positioned to affect the politics of empires and kingdoms that prefer stability to speed. Women in Scythian society are visible in ways uncommon in many other ancient cultures. They manage households, herd animals, and in many accounts, may bear weapons and ride into battle when the need demands. The extent of their involvement in warfare varies with time and place, but the archaeological evidence and classical descriptions together paint a picture of women who could be both domestic keepers and powerful figures in the wider social arena. Their role in ritual and burial practices is especially striking. Graves with weapons and horses beside women challenge simple stereotypes and suggest complex gender roles within their society. Grave mounds, or kurgans, are where the Scythian world sometimes pauses to lay down its stories in stone and earth. These mounds are constructed with immense care, often containing chambers lined with timber and filled with goods meant to accompany the dead into the next life. The extravagance of some burials reveals nodes of wealth and a belief that life continues beyond physical death in a form that still needs horses, weapons, drink, and cherished objects. The process of burial is public and ritualized, staging grief and memory for the community while asserting status and identity through symbolic offerings. Inside those tombs, the metalwork astonishes with its finesse, portraying beasts and hybrid creatures in twisting, energetic designs that move as if alive. Gold seems to have a fluid quality in Scythian hands, shaped into plaques and appliques that cling to leather and wood, flickering with animal motifs that signify power and protection. The repeated appearance of stags, panthers, and birds in a violent, almost ecstatic style speaks of a cosmology in which animals are not decoration but language. Those motifs are not mere ornament, they are messages about dominance, protection, and the relationship between humans and the wild world they inhabit. Ritual is woven into daily life without the neat separation modern minds often assume. Offerings of first milk and spoils of the hunt are presented to the unseen forces that guard a camp, and shamans or spiritual specialists communicate with spirits through song, trance, and the careful use of smoke and herbs. The line between practical action and symbolic meaning is thin. Slaughtering an animal for sustenance might also be an offering if done with the right words and gestures. This persistent attention to the unseen brings a coherence to life on the steppe, a conviction that human action is in constant conversation with fate and weather and the temper of animals. Seasons organize everything, and each has its own labors and attentions. Spring is a time of foaling and movement to high pastures, when the herds bloom outward and camps spread like a scatter of seeds across green. Summer brings the work of constant grazing and watchfulness for overheating, and the rhythms of trade and raids pick up as movement becomes easier. Autumn is a focused harvest of preserved food and the careful rounding up of animals for winter, and winter itself is a test of endurance where warm layers, close quarters, and shared labor determine who will be nourished until the thaw. Navigation across plains that seem endless requires not just maps but rituals and markers that sit in the body and mind. Riders mark routes with cairns, rearranged stones, and the memory of a lonely oak or a bend in a river that leaves mud in an unexpected pattern. The oral tradition becomes a kind of living chart, lines of poetry, names of springs, and the sequence of ridges become an itinerary that prevents camps from wandering into scarcity. This is a culture where geography is remembered in stories and songs as much as it is in a physical map. Fever, injury, and childbirth are universal human concerns, and on the steppe these become a matter of communal competence. Plants are known not only by name but by their effect. Some roots staunch bleeding, others cool fever, and the knowledge of what to apply and how to prepare it is passed from elder to healer. Births often take place in the warmth of a packed tent with supportive women around, and the life of a newborn is measured against seasonal cycles and the available dairy for milk. Illness may be seen as both physical and spiritual, so treatments mix herbs and cautious ritual to restore both body and relation to the unseen. Fighting on the steppe is not constant, but when it happens it is swift, tactical, and often devastating. Skirmishes favor mobility and deception. A small mounted group can outmaneuver infantry, and feigned retreats can trap heavier forces into disorder. The psychology of battle is as important as arms. A raised cloud of dust can fracture morale, and a sudden volley of arrows can change the course of a confrontation in minutes. A leader must be an astute judge of terrain, time, and the temper of men, discerning when advantage lies in attack, retreat, or negotiation. Alliances are as fluid as the grass. Clans coalesce around bloodlines, marriage ties, and temporary coalitions formed against common enemies. Loyalty is earned and maintained through gifts, mutual defense, and the reciprocal sharing of spoils, but it can be negotiated or broken when circumstances change. Political life on the steppe is thus leavened with the awareness that power is ephemeral. A great warrior's fame can evaporate in a misjudged winter, and today's ally may be tomorrow's rival. The soundscape of a camp is intimate and constant. Children laugh and cry, metal is struck on metal as warriors sharpen blades, the creak of leather accompanies the untying of knots, the lowing of animals punctuates human speech. At night the conversation changes, stories stretch long and the voices flatten into the rhythm of the fire as legends are told and genealogies are rehearsed. Those tales are practical, too, encoding where past groups camped, who married whom, and what tactics succeeded in battles and hunts long ago. Horses die, sometimes suddenly, and their loss is felt like the loss of a kin. When an animal passes, the care of the community shifts, hides are used, meat shared, and the memory of the horse preserved in stories and in the care given to its foals. Rituals may follow, small or large, to acknowledge the service of the animal and to reintegrate its remains into life rather than abandoning them to wastelands. This economic acceptance of mortality is not cruelty but realism. Resources are finite and must be used with care to sustain the living. Music and sound carry meaning in ways that guide and comfort. Simple instruments like stringed lyres, flutes, and horns are adapted for outdoor performance and travel well in the hands of those who will play them. A horn can signal a herd, a gathering, or an alarm. A lullaby sung by a mother tightens the knot of family in the world. A warrior's chant before rage steals the line between fear and devotion. Sound holds the group together and carries the scent of shared purpose across the open plain. Dress and display are calibrated to environment and to message. In the heat of summer, garments are lighter, but still cut to protect from the sun and wind, and in winter furs are layered to seal in warmth. Decorative pieces are chosen because they can travel. An ornate belt buckle or a pendant made of worked bone becomes a readable signal at a distance, identifying kin and rank. The visibility of wealth is deliberate. To signal capability is sometimes to deter conflict and sometimes to invite trade and marriage. The art of killing and preparing hides converts part of the landscape into lasting possessions that will serve for clothing, tents, and trade. The skinning of a beast is both technical and solemn. Hides are worked close to the flesh, cured and stretched, their hair sometimes left to provide insulation. The same knowledge that produces durable tents also yields garments that last through seasons of cold and wind, and the color and pattern of hides may convey status or an individual's skill as a hunter. These practices are a form of conservation, creating durable goods from life taken on the steppe rather than waste. Food is shared and negotiated, and this distribution defines social equilibrium. Guests are fed according to codes of hospitality. Refusing food is rare because it signals mistrust, while overindulgence without reciprocation can erode standing. Ritual feasts mark alliances, successful raids, and funerals, and the way meat is portioned can be as important as the meat itself. Food is not only nutrition but a medium through which relationships are declared and sustained. Language itself adapts to nomadic life, rich in terms for kinship, horses, weather, and the details of pastoral practice. Words for the direction of winds, the state of grass, and the temperament of individual horses are nuanced, carrying information that would otherwise take many sentences to convey. Humor is dry and practical, often teasing that sharpens bonds, and insults can be dangerous because reputation matters so much in a culture where mobility can protect or expose you. Stories told around a fire are therefore both entertainment and instruction, a compressed manual of social and environmental knowledge. The choice of camp location involves layered calculations that include not only pasture but security and political presence. Camps may be set so that watchmen can see for miles, or tucked near a ridge that conceals activity from a hostile party. Sometimes this means sharing land with another kin group under negotiated terms, and sometimes it means moving on to avoid tension. The art of being a good neighbor is a matter of diplomacy and restraint. Overgrazing can lead to conflict, and so the careful distribution of animals among pastures is part of the quiet craft of peacekeeping. Seasonal migrations resemble great migrations of thought, with decisions made months in advance based on memory and forecast. Where to take the herds in early spring requires predicting the thaw and knowing which river crossings will be safe, and each choice can ripple across the social fabric. The leader's role is to weigh weather and diplomacy and to manage dissent when families wish to pursue different pastures. Leadership is thus practical and shared. Elders and prominent horsemen gather to discuss routes, and decisions are often argued until a consensus is found that will keep the group alive. Mortality is accepted with complex rituals that make it meaningful for survivors. Bodies are sometimes interred with elaborate goods to ensure status in the afterlife, but other times they are left to the elements or consumed in ritual to recompose life where most needed. Mourning itself is performative and pragmatic. The community must grieve, yes, but it must also maintain the herd and the camp, and so the rhythm of daily labor continues even as people pay respect. This balance between sorrow and survival is one of the steppe's steadiest lessons. Knowledge of metallurgy and leatherwork transforms daily objects into tools of efficiency and aesthetic. Metalworkers may not be numerous in a nomadic group, but their products travel far and are treasured because they last. Bits and buckles, small blades, and protective gear require skill and fuel, and these craftspeople hold an important social position because their work combines utility with prestige. An ornate scabbard or a well-tempered blade will be used, admired, and then buried to mark a life worth remembering. Animals other than horses are part of the economy and world in varied ways. Sheep and goats provide milk and wool, cattle offer heft and labor, and dogs guard and assist in herding. Each species balances the needs of the camp differently, requiring different grazing patterns and different care through seasons. Dogs, in particular, are close companions, moving between the work of herding and the intimacy of a shared tent, barking warnings, and comforting children. The whole animal economy reads like a living ledger of who eats when and who sleeps where, a careful accounting of life that extends beyond human actors. The horizon matters in a way that few settled people can imagine. Distance is a friend and a foe, a place where weather gathers and where opportunity may appear. On clear days, the mountains on the far edge can be read like a compass, their shapes and snow lines communicating long-term trends. But the horizon is also a harbinger of storms that come fast and change plans, so every journey is planned with contingencies as if the landscape itself negotiates with those who travel across it. Stories and myth keep historical memory alive in a way that binds generations. Heroes of old are spoken of as people who taught certain maneuvers, who discovered waterholes, who struck bargains with neighbors and ghosts alike. These stories are taught not as distant fables but as ongoing threads that relate directly to present choices and identities. To recite a genealogical line is to stake a claim in the world and to remember obligations owed and favors granted across decades. The idea of home is elastic, tied to people and animals rather than to a plot of earth. A child may grow up with dozens of places that feel like home, each tent and winter camp layered with memories and small rituals. The meaning of permanence is transmuted into the continuity of relationships, and so a family can be at home in a caravan that has crossed hundreds of kilometers. This elasticity does not make attachments shallow. On the contrary, it requires a dense weave of relation because to carry home lightly is to risk losing it entirely. Clothing and ornament often carry cosmological meaning, with motifs that do more than impress. They mark lineage, invoke protection, and sometimes narrate a personal history. A decorated belt might tell of heroic ancestors, while a certain animal motif might be worn as a charm against misfortune. Inscriptions and designs are thus portable statements of belief and belonging. When people meet on the plain, they read each other's garments as carefully as a lettered report, gleaning rank, affiliation, and reputation at a glance. The taste of the landscape appears in their cuisine and in their senses. Fermented drinks, salted meats, and the tang of dried cheese become familiar like a dialect, comforting and practical. Spices are rare but valued, trading in small quantities that imbue a large pot of stew or a ceremonial cup with distant flavors. Dining is a social ritual, often communal, where the sharing of a cup seals deals and resets relationships after disputes. When children come of age, their transition is often marked by demonstrations of skill, a successful hunt, or a careful ride. These events are public rehearsals of competence, where the community admires and judges. Marriage arrangements blend love and strategy, they unite herds and form new alliances, and the dowry is as much an economic balancing as it is a social bond. Parents teach their offspring not just skills but stories of how earlier unions shaped the present, so marriage is both personal and political. Whether shapes law in practical ways, contracts may be verbal and conditional upon seasons, and oaths are bound by the presence of witnesses and offerings to the unseen. Hospitality, too, is enforced socially. A traveler accepted into a tent expects safety, and the violation of that trust can produce feuds that ripple across paths and years. The legal thumbprint of the steppe is therefore informal but binding, enforced by reputation and reciprocal obligations rather than by a standing judge. This is a world tempered by risk and emboldened by resourcefulness. People learn to think in terms of margins. How many animals can be spared this year? What length of journey can be risked for trade? How to store enough grain for a bad winter? The art of making do is not the same as impoverishment. It is an expertise in stretching resources without breaking bonds. Survival, in this sense, is an ethical practice as much as it is a technical one. The Scythians' relationship with death is layered and relational. Burial goods remind the living that death is not a thin line but a crossing where obligations continue in other forms. In some graves, the inclusion of attendants and animals suggests a belief in the continuity of social roles beyond life, while other burials emphasize episodes of generosity meant to bind the deceased to remembered glory. The rituals around death thus fold the past into the living present, providing a narrative continuity that steadies a life accustomed to movement. As seasons accumulate, reputations harden into lineage and law. Stories of heroic raids and wise leaders nourish the idea of a people whose mobility is their strength and whose knowledge is stored in bodies more than in books. The steppe is a teacher of endurance and quick thought. Its lessons carve a people who read wind and grass as sure as others read stars. This is not a culture of wandering for the sake of wandering. It is a way of life that has found equilibrium in motion and in the careful tending of what matters most: horses, kin, and the constant conversation with a wide, hungry sky. Daily survival on the steppe is an orchestra of small acts that, taken together, create a durable life. From mending a strap in the half-light to judging when pasture is exhausted, each action responds to the reality that everything will move again tomorrow. The freedom of the wide plain is never naive. It requires discipline, knowledge, and the cooperative labor of a community. In this way, the Scythian life is astonishing in its simplicity and profound in its complexity, a people who turned mobility into an art, who rid the world in grass and dust and weather and wrote their stories in gold and memory. The steppe is a living thing, and to understand the Scythians you must imagine a landscape that stretches like an ocean of grass, wind moving over it in waves and horizons that promise nothing but room to ride. Out there, the laws of settlement and defense are different. To survive you must be fast, flexible, and ready to move at any hour. The Scythians became masters of that environment, shaping a culture of warfare and expansion that turned mobility into both shield and sword. Mobility was not simply the ability to ride quickly, It was an entire way of organizing life so that every element of society supported movement. A Scythian warrior slept in a felt tent that could be folded and lashed to a horse, carried his home and family goods as part of his herd, and kept arms and armor designed to be serviceable on the back of a mount. Horses were not tools to be saddled and forgotten. They were partners, trained from foalhood to carry a rider and respond to subtle commands at full gallop. The heart of Scythian power was the horse and bow combination, and that pairing rewrote the rules of battle on the Eurasian steppes. Their bows were short, deeply recurved works of composite construction, layered with wood, horn, and glue to store enormous energy in a compact frame. From horseback, these bows could be drawn and fired with deadly speed, transforming the rider into a mobile artillery piece capable of raining arrows on an enemy from a distance and then melting away before the foe closed. Horsemanship made possible not just accurate shooting but also complex battlefield maneuvers. Scythian riders could shoot from the flank, fire while wheeling, and execute sudden reversals of direction that left heavier infantry units disordered. Their tactics emphasized unpredictability. They would harass and probe, then feign retreat to draw pursuers into traps or into killing zones where hidden contingents lay in wait. The feigned retreat is often described as the emblem of nomadic cunning, and it was effective because it exploited the psychology of soldiers trained for close combat and pitched battles. An enemy sees retreat and is tempted to chase, extending into a thinned line, abandoning formation and cohesion. At that moment the Scythians would turn, releasing a storm of arrows or slashing with short, brutal blades at the flanks and rear, turning pursuit into catastrophe. Equipment reflected mobility. Scythian swords were typically short and single-edged, almost saber-like in function, optimized for slashing from horseback rather than long-thrusting duels. They carried compact spears and lances that could be thrown or used in close quarters, and small, efficient shields that did not hamper movement. The design of each weapon answered the same question: how do I hurt someone while I am moving faster and farther than they expect? Armor existed, but it was selective, a compromise between protection and speed. Wealthier warriors might wear scale armor of bronze or iron, protecting chest and shoulders while leaving limbs more free. Leather garments reinforced with metal plates offered decent defense without weighing down a rider who might need to gallop for a day and a night, and helmets were sometimes fitted with cheek guards to preserve hearing and sight while deflecting blows. The battlefield itself became elastic in Scythian hands, expanding outward from a center of gravity that was mobility. There were rarely set-piece sieges or static lines when the Scythians held the advantage. They preferred to control the tempo, attacking supply trains, raiding settlements at dawn and dusk, and avoiding the slow grind of sieges unless such actions served a strategic objective. They turned space into a weapon by denying their enemies the ease of movement through the steppe, harrying logistics, and picking targets by opportunity and convenience. Scythian expansion was gradual and opportunistic, a diffusion of power that sometimes looked like migration and other times like episodic raiding. In the early 1st millennium BCE, they spread westward from Central Asia into the Pontic steppe and established dominance over vast tracts of land that connected Europe and Asia. This expansion was not merely conquest in the sedentary sense, it was a remaking of the map through control of routes, alliances with local tribes, and the projection of military power across great distances. Diplomacy accompanied the lance as an instrument of expansion. The Scythians negotiated, formed client relationships, and extracted tribute when it served them, but they were also willing to back demands with sudden displays of force. Their mobility made those displays hard to anticipate and harder to counter, because by the time a sedentary power marshaled forces, the Scythians could be gone, or the landscape itself had been altered to deny a clear path of approach. Their encounters with empires read like a study in asymmetry. Take the Persian campaigns across the steppe, for instance, a great army accustomed to fighting in ordered formations found itself chasing shadows, unable to bring the nomads to a decisive battle. Accounts recount Scythian strategies of retreat and scorched earth, refusing to defend fixed positions and instead luring invaders into supply deserts where horses and men were worn down. The result was exhaustion and failure for many would-be conquerors who tried to impose a conventional campaign on an unconventional people. This same asymmetry showed itself against Greek colonies on the Black Sea, where contact produced a complex relationship of trade, conflict, and cultural exchange. The Greeks recorded Scythian raids and treaties, and at the same time Greek craftsmen found eager patrons among Scythian elites who coveted metalwork, fine textiles, and wine. Those interactions shaped Scythian warfare, providing access to improved metal weapons and, in turn, offering the Greeks an object lesson in how mobility could dominate agrarian armies. Leadership among the Scythians was often personal and charismatic, built around chieftains or kings who proved themselves in the saddle and on the raid. A leader's legitimacy came from his success in protecting and expanding the herd, in tribute collection, and in the spoils of war that could be redistributed to followers. This created a martial aristocracy where reputation was tangible, visible in gold ornamentation, elaborate dress, and the grave goods that would accompany a warrior after death. Burial practices made clear how central warfare was to identity. The great kurgan tombs found across the steppe contained not only weapons and horses but also sacrificed servants and attendants, a grim testament to the social order that elevated war leaders even after life. These burials were statements to the living, a way to enforce lineage, claim territory, and broadcast the continuity of a war-dominated elite across generations. Archaeology has given us vivid artifacts that allow us to read the Scythian mind. Gold plaques display scenes of riders hunting and fighting, a visual language that ties hunting prowess to martial virtue. Tombs have yielded bows, quivers, and jeweled horse harnesses, artifacts that speak to a culture where the aesthetics of war were inseparable from practical outfitting, where beauty and brutality were braided into a single set of symbols. The art itself reveals how the Scythians imagined power. Stylized animals, stags, griffins, panthers, leap across metalwork as if sprung from motion, mirroring the speed and ferocity of mounted combat. These images are not mere decoration, they are a code, a set of emblems that signal membership, a warrior's status, and a cosmology in which the hunt and the battlefield are extensions of each other. The Pazyryk finds in the Altai offer a particularly haunting window into the Scythian martial life, tattooed bodies preserved in permafrost, finely worked saddles, and a woven carpet whose imagery seems to parallel the iconography found further west. Those mummies show a people who honored their dead with the trappings of their most prized skills, horses, weapons, and images of combat. The tattoos themselves may have been marks of belonging, badges of valor etched onto skin for life and for the grave. The logistics of Scythian warfare were embedded in pastoralism. A nomadic army did not march on fixed depots, it lived off the herd and the steppe, grazing horses on the way and using flocks as portable food reserves. This meant long-range campaigns were sustainable in a way that would have shocked an infantry army dependent on grain stores and wagon trains, and it allowed Scythian columns to traverse distances that would doom a stationary force. But mobility alone was not sufficient. Intelligence and reconnaissance were vital. Scouts rode ahead and around an enemy, mapping routes, finding water, and picking the moment to strike. Signals, smoke, riders, or other rapid means linked these scouts with main bodies, creating a network that could mass forces almost instantaneously across a broad front or disappear into the grass when necessary. Communication was therefore as much a tactical art as horsemanship. Commanders had to know the capabilities of their mounts, the endurance of warriors, and the terrain intimately, because decisions taken on the move would ripple through the force. This required training regimes that began in boyhood, where young riders learned to control horses at full speed, to sleep in the saddle, to shoot on the run, and to read the ground for hidden danger. The social structure reflected this orientation. Scythian boys were raised to ride, their education was practical, an apprenticeship in survival and dominance. From childhood they practiced balance, marksmanship, and controlled aggression, drills that made the horseanbow a second nature rather than a learned skill. When adulthood came, these men formed the backbone of a society whose prestige and wealth came from martial success. Not every battle was a simple shoot-and-scoot affair, and Scythians adapted tactics to conditions and opponents. Against heavily armored enemies, they would try to harass and wear down the foe, creating openings for melee troops to exploit. When the situation demanded, they could also mass into shock formations, using close cavalry to break through lines and then exploiting the breach with mounted archers to widen the collapse. Their adaptability extended to siegecraft as well, though they were not famed for lengthy sieges. If a fortification could not be taken by direct means, they might instead isolate it, intercept supplies, and starve defenders into submission. In other cases, they employed stratagems, diplomatic or deceptive, to turn a city to their cause, recognizing when a hard hand was less useful than a well-timed bribe or alliance. The Scythian identity as warriors created a ripple effect across neighboring societies, forcing changes in armament and doctrine among their foes. Greek hoplites and Persian infantry had to reckon with the steppe's mobile threat, and over time this contact led to more flexible responses, cavalry recruitment, lighter armor, and adaptations in tactic that tried to mimic or counter the nomads. Thus the Scythians, while often viewed as barbaric raiders by sedentary riders, were in fact innovators who reshaped the military thinking of their age. Their reputation for savagery in some accounts owes as much to cultural misunderstanding as to actual atrocities. Nomadic raiding involved violence, but it was also an economic system. Captives could become labor or slaves, and raised farms signaled both revenge and a message. Writers of the ancient world frequently sensationalized these acts, but archaeology confirms that violence, redistribution of wealth, and strategic terror were part of the toolkit for steppe polities. A key to their long reach was the sheer number of horses and the rate at which they could be moved. A mounted force can cover 3 to 4 times the distance of an infantry column in a day, and the Scythians exploited this relentlessly. They used relay systems, remounts, and grazing strategies that kept animals fit across long incursions, and this endurance gave them a geographic flexibility that sedentary armies found impossible to match for protracted operations. Territorial control for the Scythians was as much about influence as it was about direct occupation. They seldom planted colonies in the classical sense. Instead, they left their mark through seasonal camps, alliances with local leaders, and control of crucial river crossings and pasture lands. That created a patchwork of dominance, fluid, mobile, and resilient against the administrative structures of empires that relied on fixed taxation and fixed borders. Scythian raiding was also a major vector for cultural exchange. As they moved, they collected not only goods but ideas, styles, and technologies, bringing metalwork, pottery, and rituals into new regions. Their goldsmiths were particularly admired, producing ornaments that spread across the steppes and into the reaches of Greek and Persian markets, blending motifs in ways that testify to a constant flow of influences. When the Scythians confronted the idea of a permanent empire, their structures proved ill-suited. They could command vast expanses and conduct long-range campaigns, but they rarely developed bureaucracies to manage settled peoples at scale. That was less a weakness than a reflection of their priorities. Mobility and military skill were the axes around which their society turned, and administrative permanence was, by definition, static. Yet they adapted when needed, forming loose confederations and recognizing the need for control over trade routes and resource points. Leaders who could organize and redistribute wealth maintained their followings, and some regional polities operated with an almost imperial range of influence. These were not empires like Persia or Rome, but they were effective networks of power founded on the mobility and martial culture of the steppe. Religion and ritual intertwined with warfare in ways that reinforced mobility. The cults of steppe gods, the rites performed before campaigns, and the elaborate funeral ceremonies all sanctified the act of riding and fighting. War became a sacramental activity, each raid a liturgy that maintained social order and ensured the continuity of lineage and fame. Even the landscape became a partner in their strategies. Rivers, woodlands along riverbanks, and mountain passes were not just obstacles but opportunities. A skilled commander could use these features to ambush, delay, or trap. The ability to read terrain while on the move separated the experienced war leader from the dilettante, turning geography into an extension of tactical thought. Scythian cavalry tactics influenced later steppe peoples who followed similar paths across centuries. The patterns of mounted archery, feigned flight, and the mixture of light and heavy cavalry would reappear in the armies of the Huns, the Avars, and the Mongols. In this sense, Scythian innovation was ancestral, a template that other mobile powers borrowed, adapted, and perfected across time. Their prowess also left a linguistic and cultural footprint, seeding legends and terms into Greek and Near Eastern narratives. Stories of arrow storms and phantom raids fed into an image of invincible horsemen who seemed to appear from nowhere and then vanish. That mythology, while often exaggerated, reflects a real strategic reality. The steppe rider was an unpredictable exponent of violence, and that unpredictability was itself a weapon. Of course, not every conflict ended in Scythian victory. They were sometimes defeated by better organized infantry, trapped in terrain that denied them maneuver, or undone by internal divisions. Mobility is powerful but not omnipotent. Supply lines, diplomacy, and the politics of alliances still mattered. When they met a well-led adversary who could negate their advantages, the Scythians had to innovate or retreat. Still, the evidence of their skill is everywhere, from battle scars on ancient bones to the pattern of settlements they left behind. Graves full of weapons tell us that war was central to their social order, and the distribution of these graves maps a corridor of influence that crossed the Eurasian plain. Each object recovered is a sentence in a story of mobility, a testament to a people who lived by movement and used that movement to define power. The art of the saddle and harness was no small matter. A rider who can remain steady at speed has an enormous advantage in both offense and defense. Scythian saddles and bridles, elaborately decorated in some cases, were practical innovations that improved stability and control. The design allowed riders to brace and to shoot with the torso freed, a mechanical advantage that translated directly into battlefield dominance. Training regimens were tailored to maintain that advantage. Riders practiced shooting while galloping, recovering from falls, and managing multiple horses. They developed techniques for transferring from a tired mount to a fresh one under pressure, a skill that let them ride long distances in a day and remain combat effective on arrival. Scouting and counterscouting became arts in their own right. A good scout could disguise movements, mislead pursuers, and exploit natural cover to collect information. Conversely, an army that could blind these scouts or turn their own reconnaissance against them could gain the upper hand, and historical accounts sometimes hinge on which side better controlled the eyes and ears of the campaign. Logistical cunning also meant that the Scythians hardly needed to carry large baggage trains. They harvested what the steppe offered and seized stores when necessary, but they also used seasonal cycles, moving with the pastures and timing incursions to correspond with availability of forage. That discipline allowed them to strike in seasons when a static army might be immobilized by weather or lack of supplies. We must not overlook the role of women and families in this mobile warfare culture. Women shared in the movement of camps, in the management of herds, and in the maintenance of gear, contributing to the resilience of a society on the move. In some cases, women are reported to have taken part in fighting or to have held positions of influence, and their labor behind the lines was a crucial component of sustained mobility. Language and oral tradition kept strategy and memory alive across generations. Without permanent libraries or monuments on every hill, the Scythians transmitted knowledge through stories, songs, and the naming of places. These oral archives contained lessons in tactics, genealogies of leadership, and the moral codes that justified raids and punished excess, creating a cultural continuity that made mobility into a disciplined art. Trade networks were an extension of martial reach. Control of routes meant access to exotic goods and new technologies. The Scythians were not isolated barbarians but active participants in an interconnected world, exchanging furs, horses, and slaves for metalwork, wine, and finished goods. This commerce fed into their war economy, enabling elites to display power through ornament and to procure specialist weapons when needed. Conflicts over pasture and grazing rights were a frequent spur to arms. Mobility meant movement for survival, and where herds met with borderlands of other groups, disputes arose. These were not abstract wars of ideology but pragmatic contests over resources essential to life, which is why warfare for the Scythians often had immediate material logic tied to weather, herd health, and season. The psychology of mounted warfare shaped risk-taking behavior. A community confident in its ability to move could afford the political risks of raid and retreat, exploiting vulnerabilities far from home. This allowed daring leaders to attempt bold maneuvers, crossing rivers during floods, riding through mountain passes in winter, because the cost of failure was mitigated by the capacity to relocate and regroup on a broad landscape. Disease and environmental pressures also influenced campaigns. Harsh winters or droughts could force a concentration of people and animals around scarce resources, creating flashpoints for conflict. Conversely, abundant seasons could enable longer raids and wider expansion. The Scythians read these cycles and timed their activities accordingly, adapting not just to men but to climate itself. The image of Scythian savagery in classical sources needs to be balanced with the evidence of restraint and calculation. Raiding was targeted and often performed with an eye toward long-term alliances and trade stability. A scorched field policy could yield immediate gain but destroy the very markets and routes a nomad needed. Leaders understood that the economy of movement required a measure of restraint. Their military culture produced specialists, archers, lancers, horse breeders, and armorers, each contributing to the efficiency of the fighting force. Blacksmiths who could make resilient arrowheads, bowyers adept at composite construction, and leatherworkers who kept tacks supple were as valuable as field captains. This division of labor turned mobility into a replicable system rather than a series of sporadic exploits. Over time, external pressures pushed Scythian societies to change and to borrow. Encounters with ironworking neighbors, with Greek fortifications, and with the administrative apparatus of empires demanded adaptations. The Scythians incorporated new weapons, adjusted tactics, and sometimes settled along river basins, forming hybrid communities that retained mobility as a core, even while adopting elements of sedentary life. The ultimate lessons of Scythian mobility lie in the combination of technology, training, and cultural organization. The composite bow, the practice of year-round horsemanship, the logistical reliance on herds, and the social valorization of martial prowess combined to make a military system that was more than the sum of its parts. They turned the landscape into an ally and taught their descendants how to move war across the earth with speed and purpose. Even in decline, their influence persisted. As successor nomadic groups rose and fell, the tactical vocabulary the Scythians developed remained in use, echoed in the mounted assaults of later horse peoples who would make even greater empires from the same principles. In this way, the Scythians were not only warriors of their time but architects of a broader nomadic ethos that would shape Eurasian history for millennia. What modern readers and listeners must remember is that mobility was not an accident of lifestyle but a deliberate, cultivated strength. It required investment, breeding horses, making bows, training youths, and embedding warfare in every strata of society. In the hands of the Scythians, these investments paid dividends that altered the political map of an entire continent. To imagine a Scythian campaign is to picture scenes of controlled chaos, riders boiling across plains, arrows darkening the sky like a flock of birds, leaders signaling with gestures or swift horsemen, wagons and tents packing as day shifts toward night. It is to sense the quiet discipline behind the visible fury, the calm amid motion that made temporary triumphs possible and long-term dominance credible. Finally, the story of Scythian warfare and expansion is not just a military chronicle but a study of how humans adapt their societies to place and make power from motion. Their mastery of mobility teaches that geography and culture are inseparable in war, that speed can outthink strength, and that a people who make motion a virtue can alter the fate of regions and empires. The Scythians rode the steppe and, in doing so, they wrote a chapter in history that still echoes in the thunder of distant hooves. Across a landscape that seems to breathe with wind and horizon, the Scythians moved as if they belonged to the very air and grass. Their lives were braided from horsehair, sinew, and sky, a pattern both practical and poetic that drew the eye of every traveler who crossed the steppe. To walk with them in imagination is to feel the creak of leather saddles and the soft drip of dawn on embroidered cloth, to sense the world as a route rather than a map. When the sun tilted low and the long grasses bent like waves, they thought in stories rather than in lines on paper. Those stories were not idle ornaments but architectures of belief, scaffolds for how to live, how to die, and how to be remembered. Myth for the Scythian was a tool as precise as a well-cast arrow, shaping identity and ordering the unpredictable movements of nomadic life. Herodotus, the Greek who first called their world to wider notice, wrote of kings and rituals and the curious things a foreigner notices, tattoos on the skin, the nomads' love for horseback, and their extravagant burials. He filtered what he saw through his own Mediterranean sensibility, yet his voice gives us a narrative bridge, a string that modern minds can follow into a past otherwise silent. Archaeology has since peeled back layers Herodotus could not imagine, and yet his tales still hum beneath the dust of excavation. To the Scythians, the world was populated by powers that could be spoken with or outraged, gods and spirits with names whispered around fires. There were sky forces that regulated seasons and wind, earth powers that determined fertility, and hearth presences that tended the domestic and sacred flame. These were not separate compartments. Divinities overlapped with animals, rivers, and the dead, all woven into a living cosmology. Among the pantheon that scholars have tried to reconstruct, some figures appear again and again, though not with the neatness of a written canon. Tabidi, a goddess associated with hearth and fire, carried the warmth and continuity of home even as people moved across open spaces. Other divine names shift in the sources and are often filtered through Greek analogues, but their functions, fire, sky, earth, and chthonic power, remain visible like footprints in snow. The Scythian view of ancestry was concrete and immediate, families traced back through heroic figures who acted as both blood and law. These ancestral figures supplied authority and the right to claim pastures and prestige, and they were often celebrated in stories told around a central fire. In a culture where movement was the rule, memory anchored the present to a sacred past that justified rank and shaped obligations. Women in Scythian society appear in the sources and the graves in ways that complicate classical expectations. Greek storytellers turned some of them into Amazons, framing strong, horse-riding women as a sensational exception, but archaeology reveals that elite Scythian women often carried weapons, horses, and grave goods that signaled both authority and autonomy. The lived reality likely allowed for a range of roles: mothers, riders, ritual specialists, and the burials of women with full accoutrements point to a social logic that was different from settled agrarian norms. Burial practices, perhaps more than any other material trace, reveal how the Scythians thought about life, death, and the threads that bind them. The kurgan, or burial mound, rose from the plain like intentional geography, a deliberate punctuation mark upon endless horizon. Big and small, visible for miles, these earthen monuments functioned as memory machines, built to carry a name and story forward into the lives of those who followed. To stand at the edge of a kurgan is to feel how burial and landscape converse. Sunlight slices across layers of compacted earth, and the mound reads like the biography of a family or a leader. Inside, chambers were sometimes wood-lined, sometimes stone-built, and always arranged to give their occupant a staged afterlife. Grave goods were the language of those afterlives, objects chosen for continuity, honor, and perhaps to meet expected needs beyond the first breathlessness of death. When archaeologists first opened large Scythian mounds in the 19th and 20th centuries, they revealed rooms that looked as if the occupants might return by evening. Horses lay with bridles still in place, food vessels were set as if dining were to begin anew, and ornate weapons leaned against walls as if ready for one last ride. These were not mere hoards, they were compositions of a culture's values, curated to give meaning to the passage from living world to ancestral status. The craft that went into Scythian objects tells a quiet story of contacts and innovation. Goldsmiths hammered images of deer, feline predators, and hybrid beasts into plaques and harness fittings with a finesse that belied a nomadic existence. The so-called animal style is not a single motif but a grammar, a way of showing power through the energy of animals frozen mid-leap or mid-bite, signifying a readiness to act in a world where movement was a virtue. One body of finds that captures both mystery and intimacy is the Pazyryk burials of the Altai Mountains, where cold-locked textiles, woodwork, and even skin in a cryogenic time capsule. There is astonishing preservation, felt rugs patterned like tapestries and horses whose harnesses still glitter with gold. Perhaps most haunting are the tattooed bodies, with sinuous animal figures inked into skin, patterns that suggest personal cosmologies and identities worn like living armor. The tattooed corpses of Pazyryk seem to speak in a language of the body, a private sermon turned public testament. Inked stags and griffins trace the veins of arms and shoulders, images that might represent clan affiliations, protection, or mythic journeys. To see those figures is to sense how the skin itself became a canvas for belief, a mobile shrine that traveled with a person from mare to mound. Tattoos and decorative animal motifs are not mere adornment. In the Scythian mindset, they intersect with metamorphosis and power. Stories told around the fire spoke of heroes who took animal shape and of shamans who mediated between human and beast. The visual arts seemed to echo those narratives, suggesting a world where identity could be fluid and where the boundary between human and more than human was porous. Funeral feasting, recorded by Herodotus and echoed in the bones and pottery found in graves, was part of the ritual unfolding around death. Feasts anchored community, cemented alliances, and enacted obligations toward the dead, who were not simply buried then forgotten but carried forward as potent figures whose expectations influenced the living. Drinking vessels, finely worked cups, and the remains of food make clear that the end of a life was a social event of wide significance. Ritual sacrifice has its own complex place in Scythian culture, especially in funerary contexts where attendants and animals were sometimes placed in tombs with the dead. Ancient sources describe attendants chosen to join a deceased lord in the grave, and archaeology has corroborated that some burials include multiple human skeletons arranged as if in service. The moral and spiritual logic was not simple cruelty but a belief that certain worldly relations had to be maintained into the next state of existence. Horses, perhaps more than any single species, anchor Scythian ritual imagination. Horses were both practical engines of mobility and symbols of status and cosmic connection. A horse might be sacrificed beside a chariot and richly furnished to accompany its master, suggesting a conviction that the animal's companionship and speed would continue beyond the last sunset. Funerary horses often were the full bridle and ornamentation of their living service, a visual insistence on continuity. Harness plates shimmer with gold, often with animal motifs that echo the human gear nearby, as if individual bodies and their mounts were meant to face together whatever lay beyond. In some chambers, human and horse remains are arranged with ritual precision, underscoring the idea that prestige in life sought replication in death. The burial chamber itself is a staged landscape, an intentionally constructed world in miniature. Chambers might mimic domestic space with beds, chests, and carved wooden posts, or they might be designed to represent the cosmovision of a leader whose power extended beyond the ordinary. The placement of objects, the direction of the head, and the orientation of doors all mattered in ways that archaeologists only slowly piece together. Inside these chambers, objects tell stories about trade and contact. Silk fragments from the Far East, metals and gems from distant workshops, and implements crafted with diverse techniques indicate that Scythian elite were nodes in a vast network of exchange. A burial is therefore a small museum of connections, an index of how steppe life was far from isolated but dynamically linked across continents. In the votive richness of some tombs there is also an echo of politics. A leader's prestige could be read in the quantity and quality of goods, a material declaration of power translated into the afterlife. Gold was not mere glitter, it served as an enduring signifier of status that made certain claims legible across time and to any who might gaze upon the mound. Gold plaques often depict hybrid creatures, griffins with the intensity of a predator's stare, winged stags caught mid-leap, and this iconography seems to mark borders between worlds. Hybrids can belong to no single place, they are emissaries of a world beyond, creatures that can cross thresholds and mediate between human and divine spheres. In that sense, they are fitting guardians for tombs that intend to maintain a liminal, ongoing presence. If the grave is a crossing, then the burial rite is choreography, a sequence of acts performed to ensure a safe transit. The ritual might include the burning of herbs, the slaughter of animals, and the placement of objects meant to appease powers that oversaw life after death. These acts were communal, reaffirming social bonds while simultaneously investing the deceased with a new, honored status. Herodotus's narrative of Scythian funeral rites includes dramatic elements, the burning of a prince's palace, the consumption of live attendants, elements that must be read with caution and in context. Some aspects he reports find support in archaeology, others seem colored by Greek fascination and rhetorical flourish, and yet both the literary and material records together give a fuller, if complicated, picture. The truth, as usual, is layered, ritual as spectacle, ritual as necessity, ritual as narrative. Burial mounds are also repositories of violence and memory in the broad sense. They mark victories and losses, showcase spoils of raids and items exchanged or gifted, and sometimes even incorporate objects taken from enemies. As persistent landscape features, they can become focal points of identity for generations that follow, a continuous address for ancestors who remain influential in local political life. The visibility of kurgans on the steppe transforms them into social anchors, meeting places that stitch families and clans into a shared topography. Over time, a series of mounds can create a line of memory across miles, a cartography of belonging made not by fences and posts, but by earth piled and compacted to keep a story alive. In a culture without dense masonry, these earthen monuments function as fixed texts, legible to those who knew how to read them. Archaeology, with its slow, careful method, has been the hand that lifted the veil from many Scythian practices. Each excavation is a negotiation between the living present and dead past, a careful unwrapping that seeks to respect both scientific rigor and cultural sensitivity. The material remains, bones, beads, textiles, provide empirical anchors for hypotheses about ritual, belief, and daily life, but interpretation is always a conversation that requires humility. Preservation challenges complicate the story. Many mounds were looted long before modern archaeologists arrived, and the trafficking of plundered items into markets in the 19th and 20th centuries scattered treasures across museums and private collections. This dispersal both democratized access and fractured contexts, making it harder to reconstruct the original arrangement and meaning of finds. Modern archaeologists thus work against time and theft to assemble credible reconstructions. Conservation has also unveiled surprising technologies and skills. Textile fibers preserved in cold climates demonstrate weaving techniques that rival those of settled civilizations, while woodwork shows carpentry adapted to a mobile life. In these objects, ingenuity is evident not only in ornamental luxury but in the practical engineering of a culture built on movement and adaptability. The Pazyryk rugs themselves are a marvel of both artistry and mobility, herding color and pattern across fibers in a way that suggests a sophisticated aesthetic sensibility. To imagine such a rug unrolled in a wooden tent on a high-altitude plain brings into focus the Scythian eye for both comfort and symbolic display. These are not just furnishings, they are portable theaters in which social dramas unfold. Beyond the monuments, oral tradition likely carried a tremendous weight in shaping belief. Stories transmitted across generations are not static, they adapt, picking up new meanings as conditions change. In the absence of widespread literacy, memory and recitation were the vectors of law, myth, and identity, and the oral nature of myth allowed it to serve both as a mnemonic device and as a flexible social script. The shamanic element in Scythian religion is another thread that runs through both text and material culture. Shamans, healers, and ritual specialists could cross thresholds, interpreting omens and mediating with spirits that hovered at the edges of the visible world. Their role was not merely mystical, it was social and practical, resolving crises, guiding hunts, and securing blessings for movements across contested landscapes. The material traces of shamanic practice remain fragmentary, but objects like ritually used daggers, altars, or symbolic paraphernalia point to practices that combine the sacred and the pragmatic. A shaman's paraphernalia might contain animal skins, feathers, or carved implements that encoded mythic narratives while also functioning as props in ritual performance. Seen this way, religious practice was an embodied set of skills as much as a set of beliefs. Mythic narratives often explain origins through marriages of gods to mortals or heroic acts that shaped the social order. In Scythian lore, these stories could anchor claims of rulership and provide a template for behavior expected of leaders and communities. When a clan traces its roots to a legendary figure, they are not merely telling a story, they are invoking a charter for social and political life. Scythian cosmology sometimes presents the world as layered, with a sky realm, the surface world, and an underworld where the dead dwell. Rituals aim to maintain balance across these layers, to ensure that the deceased neither dominate the living nor be forgotten into an inert void. Funerary practices are therefore a negotiation, a way of placing the deceased within an ordered cosmos that benefits both the dead and those who remain. Symbolic language of threshold and passage reappears across the funerary complex: doors and chambers, the orientation of bodies, the placement of guardian animals, and the use of hybrid imagery. Thresholds were liminal spaces that needed to be managed, and the rituals that regulated them show an awareness of the dangers and possibilities inherent in crossing. The dead, once properly housed, could act as allies rather than threats. Grief and celebration intermingled in these rites, and the communal expression of mourning was as much about reaffirming life as it was about acknowledging loss. Songs, recitations, and staged acts provided structure to what otherwise would be raw despair. Memory practice, in that sense, was therapeutic but also civic. Communities were held together through shared recollection and ritual performance. The material sophistication of weapons and armor in elite graves indicates that martial prowess was a central value, but this was not mere brutality. The crafts and aesthetics involved were embedded within a broader ethic of honor. Bows, quivers, swords, and daggers were made for effectiveness and for statement, adorned to communicate rank and to participate in a visual language of prestige. A decorated scabbard or an inlaid bow was a badge as much as it was a tool. Scythian bows were deadly in the hands of horsemen whose entire riding technique turned speed and surprise into governance. Mounted archery gave Scythian groups strategic advantages, enabling raids that could cross great distances and influence politics far beyond the steppe. This technological and tactical synergy between horse and bow shaped both warfare and the social prestige attached to martial skill. In myths and art, the horse often bears symbolic weight beyond its instrumental role. Horses feature in origin stories, carry souls, and appear as companions in scenes of both hunting and combat. The intimate relationship between rider and animal is depicted with tenderness and precision, suggesting that this bond was both practical and spiritual. Over centuries, the Scythians encountered, traded with, and fought peoples to their west and east, creating a matrix of cultural exchange that complicates any tidy picture of them as isolated nomads. Greek city-states along the Black Sea, Iranian-speaking groups, and peoples of the steppe all left impressions on Scythian life and were influenced in return. The result was a porous cultural landscape where ideas, objects, and people moved continuously. Greek craftsmen sometimes worked for Scythian patrons, and Greek pottery and coinage turn up within the tombs, evidence of both trade and taste. Such objects would be integrated into Scythian ritual life, reinterpreted and recontextualized within a nomadic frame. This cultural interweaving undermines simple binaries of civilized versus barbarian and shows the Scythians as active participants in a wider Eurasian world. At the same time, the Scythians cultivated a distinct identity through dress and ornamentation that signaled group membership. Felt caps, patterned tunics, and intricate belts conveyed belonging and rank in a visual language recognizable across moving camps. Dress operated as mobile heraldry, broadcasting skill and lineage to allies and rivals alike. Religious syncretism did occur, as local gods were identified with foreign ones and mythic frameworks adapted to new realities. Deities could be equated with Greek gods in the accounts of observers, but the underlying functions often remained local and particular. The movement of ideas was selective, taking what served social ends and folding it into existing structures of ritual power. When modern archaeologists unearth a kurgan, they encounter not just objects but traces of time layered with human intention. Soil strata, pollen analysis, and residue tests reveal climate, season of burial, and even types of food consumed. These scientific readings enrich narrative with detail, enabling us to reconstruct not only beliefs but environmental contexts that shaped ritual choices. The season in which a burial occurred, for example, could affect the goods included and the logistics of moving a corpse and its entourage. Winter burials might favor certain materials and preserve things that would otherwise vanish in warmer seasons. Summer burials might include perishable offerings whose presence is only hinted at by residue. Understanding the seasonal axis helps make sense of choices that might otherwise seem arbitrary. Ethnographic analogy is another tool scholars use cautiously to interpret Scythian practices, comparing them to living or historically recorded nomadic societies. Such comparisons illuminate possibilities of ritual behavior, social organization, and cosmology, but must be handled carefully to avoid overstretched parallels. Context remains king. Each culture is a particular weave of environment, history, and imagination. Modern national narratives have sometimes appropriated Scythian imagery to build continuity with ancient pasts, and the treasures pulled from mounds have been enlisted into museums as emblems of identity. This politicization complicates scholarly neutrality and raises ethical questions about heritage, ownership, and representation. The objects themselves are polyvalent, works of art, archaeological data, and symbols contested in the present. Museums display golden plaques and harness fittings beneath glass with placards explaining provenance, but the story does not end there. The relocation of artifacts from burial mounds into museum cases removes them from the landscapes that shaped their meaning, transforming active commemorations into curated exhibits. The ethics of display, repatriation, and the narratives told around objects remain active debates in the study of Scythian culture. Looting has been a particularly corrosive force, destroying contexts that could answer questions about ritual sequencing and social ties. Once a mound is looted, reconstructing the lives and deaths it contained becomes exponentially harder, like trying to read a letter torn into pieces and scattered. Modern heritage protection is partly a response to this loss, aiming to conserve what remains for rigorous study and public reflection. Archaeological ethics also ask how to involve descendant communities, when such lineages can be traced, in decisions about excavation and display. The steppe is home to many peoples today whose identities intersect in complex ways with the ancient past, and their voices deserve a place in discussions about treasures and mounds. Collaboration can enrich interpretation, making it more participatory rather than extractive. Photographs and recordings of excavations have transformed how the public perceives ancient nomads, making private finds into shared spectacles. The visual drama of a chamber revealed after millennia draws us into empathy with the past, but it might also oversimplify. Responsible storytelling balances the allure of spectacle with reflection on the ambiguity and contingency that archaeology always contains. The concept of sacred landscape is crucial to understanding Scythian burial practices. Mounds shaped the map of ancestral territory, serving as mnemonic and legal points that anchored claims to grazing land and resources. In that way, ritual labor performed at a mound was as much a social contract as a religious act, a way to say, "This is ours, and our dead will watch over it." Archaeologists reading the steppe must therefore attend to both the physical and symbolic placement of mounds, to distances between them, and to nearby natural features like rivers or hills. Such spatial analysis reveals the logic of settlements, trade routes, and conflict, showing that the landscape was not an empty stage but an actor in social life. Each mound dialogued with the land, asserting presence and shaping movement. Stories of transformation and hybrid creatures suggest a worldview comfortable with liminality, a tolerance for boundaries that are permeable rather than absolute. Such a worldview allows for ritual persons who cross categories, shamans who wear animal skins, leaders who adopt divine names, and myths where humans become beasts. The funerary context crystallizes this fluidity, staging a final metamorphosis in which the dead may gain new, hybridized identities. Painted objects and carved bones also offer glimpses into timekeeping and calendrical ideas, suggesting that certain rituals were performed at particular times. The marking of seasons, cycles of life and death, and agricultural or pastoral rhythms shaped when and how ceremonies took place. Temporal regularity provided a framework for communal memory, making certain practices predictable and durable. The intersection of myth and law is another subtle feature of Scythian culture. Legendary narratives often encoded social rules about marriage, inheritance, and conflict, serving as precedents for resolving disputes. In a mobile environment, the moral authority of myth could be especially valuable, as it offered a shared set of references that could be invoked when written law was absent. In recounting myth, a storyteller both preserves the past and adjusts it, tailoring episodes to contemporary needs. Those adaptations mean that myth is rarely pure antiquity, it is a living conversation. A tale told at a funeral might emphasize lineage, while the same story told at a feast could stress martial valor. The flexibility is part of myth's power. The presence of artisans skilled in gold, leather, and textile work suggests a class of craftspeople whose knowledge formed the backbone of elite display. Their work was both technical and symbolic, combining functional excellence with imagery that encoded social meaning. Patronage of such artisans was itself a form of political expression, an investment in reputation that would outlive a single generation. In moments of excavation, when a golden plaque is turned up and buffed of its earth, the touch between modern hands and ancient craft closes a loop across time. The object bridges centuries, inviting questions that archaeology can answer only partially. Who wore it? What song accompanied its making? What conversation ended with its placement in a grave? These are the kinds of speculative spaces where scholarship and imagination meet. The Scythian imagination retained an ambivalence toward permanence and change, celebrating mobility while investing in markers that would last. Burial mounds are the clearest expression of this double commitment, simultaneously asserting the necessity of movement and the need for anchors. The ritual choices made at death negotiate those competing claims, constructing an afterlife that mirrored the values of a life spent on the move. Climate and environmental shifts over centuries also affected the nomadic way of life and thus the rituals surrounding it. Droughts, cold snaps, and the shifting distribution of pastures impacted patterns of migration, social organization, and even the scale of burial practices. Archaeological evidence of changing flora and fauna in mound layers can speak to how communities adapted, and how those adaptations in turn altered their ritual life. The archaeology of the Scythians has a temporal sweep that can illuminate long-term changes in belief and practice. Over generations, what is buried, how it is arranged, and which symbols are favored reflect slowly shifting patterns of identity. Tracking those shifts helps to reveal not a static culture but one that evolves in response to internal dynamics and external pressures. Linguistic evidence is fragmentary, but names preserved in classical texts and inscriptions give hints of the verbal world of the Scythians. Words for gods, titles, and certain ritual terms survive in traces, and etymology can suggest connections across regions. Language, like art and burial practice, was part of the web tying individuals to a collective past and a shared cosmology. The pull of the Scythian past into modern consciousness often relies on images of gold and nomadic freedom, but to reduce them to romantic stereotype would be to miss their political and spiritual sophistication. The funerary world is where their philosophy of life is most concentrated, a design for continuity, a theology of mobility, and a public language of memory. The mounds speak to us not only of death, but of how a people imagine time and obligation. Long nights around a communal fire would have been the laboratory where myths were tested and retooled, where storytellers refined narratives that explained everything from how to lead a raid to how to honor a fallen comrade. Those stories guided action and gave rhetorical form to social dilemmas. Ritual performance turned narrative into lived reality, embedding mythic lessons into the muscle memory of a people. In reading the dead, we also read the living, for choices made in grief are choices about the future. Which objects are placed into a tomb tell us who the living want to remember and why, and those decisions shape memory just as surely as they record it. Modern listeners should imagine funerary rites as acts of invention, where the living compose a future history for themselves even as they consign a person to the past. The enduring fascination with Scythian mounds has as much to do with the human drama they contain as with the glittering artifacts. In those burial chambers are the traces of love and fear, allegiance and rivalry, artistry and faith. To attend to them is to step into a world where belief and practice were woven together with a care that resonates across millennia. In our own time, the dialogue between myth and material persists as scholars, curators, and descendants negotiate how best to tell the story. New technologies, DNA analysis, isotope studies, high-resolution imaging open fresh ways to read bones and fabrics, revealing diets, origins, and movements with a precision once unavailable. Each new method lets us align mythic narratives with biological and environmental data, enriching the picture without reducing it to mere data points. The Scythian mounds remain, standing like deliberate questions upon the plain, inviting answers that are never final. They ask us to consider how a people oriented themselves to the future through funeral work, how they translated transient life into a durable column of earth. They call us to listen, to imagine, and to recognize that across time human beings deploy ritual and myth to make sense of their mortality and to assert continuity in the face of change. To drive along the modern roads that thread former Steppe and to watch the horizon unfold is to glimpse the same dynamic presence that shaped Scythian life. The hills and plains still breathe and move under wind, and the mounds, when visible, still mark the landscape like punctuation. If you slow down for a moment and let your imagination be led by the material traces, you can almost hear drums and neighing, the murmur of stories spoken into a clearing night. In the end, the Scythians teach us about the human need to make the ephemeral enduring, to use art and ritual to push back against oblivion. Their burial mounds, their tattoos, and their animal ornaments are all atoms in a larger living body of belief that saw death not as an end but as a transformation. Those transformations were enacted with great care, with communal labor, and with imaginations large enough to hold hybrid beasts and ancestral rulers together in a single, continuous story. They rode the horizon as if the sky itself had given them leave, a living sweep of leather and mane that changed the silhouette of the steppe for 1,000 miles. Their name, Scythian, carried on the tongues of Greeks and Persians like wind carried dust, a single word that meant something at once exotic and frightening. But no empire lasts forever, and the story of the Scythians is as much about their decline as it is about their brilliant ascendancy. To understand their fall is to look at weather and war, trade and taste, bodies and graves, and the slow bending of peoples toward new directions. Decline began as a process of attrition rather than a single cataclysm, a patient erosion of institutions and advantages that had once made them masters of a world without walls. New nomads moved on older nomads, pushed by needs and opportunities, and each wave altered the balance of power on the open grasslands. The Sarmatians, the Massagetæ, and later the Alans and other Iranian-speaking groups entered the stage, sometimes as allies, sometimes as foes, and in that complicated interchange the old Scythian identity loosened. Intermarriage, cultural borrowing, and the adoption of new military techniques mixed the steppe's peoples into different shapes. Climate and ecology also had their say, subtle as a thaw and devastating as a drought, for pastoralism is a keenly responsive craft. If the grass failed, horses and herds dwindled, and if rivers shifted, trade routes shifted with them. The Scythians were not immune to these pressures. Around the turn of the first millennium BCE, variations in rainfall and localized cooling altered grazing patterns, forcing nomads to adapt by changing routes or compressing into marginal lands. Over generations, these changes could hollow out the economic base that supported mounted archers and the social elites who fed on tribute and trade. At the same time, the settled powers on the fringes of the steppe grew more capable and more interested in the riches that nomads could offer. Greek colonists along the Black Sea coast developed thriving cities, and Persian and later Hellenistic rulers extended diplomatic and commercial networks that touched nomadic bands in new ways. The lure of grain, metalwork, textiles, and coin altered relations. Raiding could be profitable, but trade promised regular returns and political entanglement. As contacts increased, so did contagion, not only goods and gold, but ideas, diseases, and administrative pressures that could reshape a nomadic lifestyle. War made trends visible. The Scythian way of fighting, fast, mounted, largely decentralized in command, had been a terrifying innovation for settled armies that expected pitched battles and fortified places. But over centuries, opponents adapted. Infantry tactics improved, cavalry tactics evolved, heavier armored riders from the east, the Sarmatians later on, pressed into the very niches the Scythians once exploited with light cavalry and composite bows. Military advantage is ephemeral when techniques spread, and without technological surprise the Scythians increasingly met adversaries on equal terms, or worse. A further erosion came from internal social transformations as warriors became aristocrats and aristocrats became sedentary. Power in Scythian society hinged on mobility, speed, and the capacity to command mounted bands. Over generations, some leaders consolidated wealth into increasingly elaborate kurgans, the burial mounds that preserved gold and formed a guidebook for archaeologists. Those same riches encouraged a sedentary accumulation of prestige that could disincentivize the very mobility that upheld military dominance. When some leaders settled into permanent seats of power in Crimea or along the Danube, their societies inched toward the rhythms of the settled world they had once skirted. The Greek cities along the Black Sea were both a mirror and a magnet. Sheepskins and slaves flowed one way, Hellenic luxury and coin the other. Greek amphorae have been found in Scythian graves, and Scythian horses and warriors appear on Greek pottery, a testament to reciprocal fascination. These exchanges altered tastes and even dress. Scythian elites began to acquire foreign goods and to participate in courtly displays that looked outward as often as inward. That outward gaze could dilute older traditions, making later generations less recognizably Scythian to an ancient chronicler or modern archaeologist. Herodotus wrote of them with wonder in the 5th century BCE, drawing an image that has stayed with historians and storytellers. He described archers who fed on raw meat and drank mare's milk, and a people both barbaric and clever in the classical imagination. But Herodotus was writing from a particular vantage, steeped in Greek conventions of what makes a people noble or savage, and his account must be read as much as literature as history. When the centuries press forward beyond his pages, archaeology becomes our main guide, and the graves tell a more complex, less sensational story. The burial practices, especially the kurgans, reveal a culture intensely concerned with death and display, ambition and continuity. Mounds built for elite warriors contain not only the dead but their horses, their gear, and a wealth of objects denoting status: gold pectorals, animal-shaped plaques, intricate metalwork in a style that modern scholars call Scythian art. These artistic conventions, zoomorphic motifs, taut sinuous lines, a preference for vivid animal encounters, spread across the steppe and into neighboring cultures. As the decorative vocabulary disseminated, it became less a marker of a single people than a shared language of steppe prestige. Yet art can preserve identity longer than military dominance can. The Scythian artistic language influenced Sarmatian work, and through centuries parts of that vocabulary echoed in the fashions of later nomads. Objects recovered from kurgans in Crimea, in the Don Valley, and in the Altai Mountains show a continuity of taste that outlasted political hegemony. In the museums of Kiev, St. Petersburg, and beyond, a Scythian stag or griffin once set in gold evokes a presence that survived conquest and absorption. These visual legacies carried ideas about power, cosmology, and identity into new contexts. Language and ethnicity are trickier to pin down than metalwork, but many scholars situate the Scythians within an Iranian-speaking family of steppe peoples. Linguistic echoes in place names and in the few glosses preserved by ancient writers suggest ties to the Eastern Iranian languages, yet languages shift and vanish with astonishing speed under pressure. As Sarmatian and other Iranian dialects rose, and later as Turkic languages moved westward, the linguistic map of the steppe redrew itself. The Scythian speech, like their empire form, transformed into something else, a palimpsest of tongues layered on one another. The move of other steppe groups into Scythian territory was at times violent and at times gradual. Archaeology shows strata of material culture that change over time. Where one finds a certain style of weapon or ornament, it eventually gives way to another. Sometimes the change is abrupt, suggesting conquest or migration. Sometimes it is a blend, suggesting assimilation and intermarriage. The Sarmatians, who rose in the first millennium BCE and dominated the steppe by the later centuries, brought heavier armor and longer lances that altered battlefield dynamics. This was not simply a story of one people replacing another, but of technologies and identities rearranging themselves under new conditions. One of the most haunting archaeological testimonies to Scythian life comes from the permafrost tombs of the Altai, where organic materials like textiles and even hair can survive for millennia. The Pazyryk finds, uncovered in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, included felt rugs, lacquered wooden objects, and bodies with tattoos that froze time into images. Those tattoos, stylized animals and geometric forms, tell us about personal and group identity in a way that metalwork cannot, because they were on flesh. Such intimate traces suggest a people with a keen sense of visual self and an appetite for symbolic expression. The graves also teach us about ritual violence and sacrifice, practices that cemented elite status and cosmological belief. Scythian tombs sometimes included sacrificed attendants, horses, and even servants, a stark reminder that their social order depended on a display of absolute authority in death as in life. These acts were costly, a consumption of human and animal life that marked hierarchical societies everywhere. Yet even these rituals could be instruments of change, as elites competed to display their power through ever more spectacular burials, depleting resources and perhaps accelerating tendencies toward sedentism. The Scythians' interactions with empires to their south also complicated their decline. Persian embassies and campaigns brushed against steppe bands, and later the conquests of Alexander the Great brought Hellenic influence deeper into regions the Scythians had known for generations. The Hellenistic kingdoms that followed Alexander's death established client rulers, fortified cities, and new patterns of administration that changed the political landscape. Some Scythian princes adapted, becoming Hellenized in dress and speech and even in their administrative habits. Others retreated into a memory of older practices that was preserved only in fragments. Trade routes provided another vector of transformation. The steppe was not an empty space, it was a corridor of exchange linking the Mediterranean to Central Asia. Scythian intermediaries carried luxuries and staples, and their mobility allowed them to tax or profit from such exchanges. But as empires consolidated control of supply lines and as maritime trade offered alternative routes, the strategic prominence of steppe intermediaries sometimes diminished. The economic logic that once supported widespread raiding and tribute could be undercut by changing patterns of commerce. Disease, though less visible in the archaeological record, likely played a role in demographic shifts. The movement of peoples and goods across Eurasia unavoidably spread diseases that could devastate populations lacking immunity. Epidemics could hollow out communities, reduce available labor for herding, and weaken military capacities. In intimate social systems, each death ripples outward, mothers and knowledge bearers gone, disruptions in herd management, and erosion of social cohesion. Over generations, disease could be an undercurrent in a story otherwise dominated by politics and climate. The religious and mythic world of the Scythians also transformed as they declined, but some elements persisted in unexpected ways. Scythian cosmology centered on animals and the forces of the steppe, with deities and spirits interwoven into daily life. As new groups took over Scythian lands, they often adopted parts of this spiritual vocabulary, retaining animal symbols and burial rites in adapted forms. In this way, Scythian religious ideas morphed into components of a broader steppe culture that survived long after the original political forms had vanished. Women appear frequently in the archaeological record and in ancient writing, sometimes in roles that surprise modern readers and that complicate simple narratives of patriarchal dominance. Accounts of Scythian women who fought alongside men, figures the Greeks mythologized into Amazons, have archaeological correlates in graves where women were interred with weapons and horses. Whether such women were common or exceptional, their presence suggests a flexibility of gender roles in some contexts and a social valorization of martial skill. As Scythian communities transformed, these gendered norms could shift too, with assimilation into settled cultures introducing new expectations and constraints. The Greek dramatists and later Roman historians reshaped Scythian images to suit their own anxieties and fantasies, creating a legacy that influenced later European thought. In medieval and Renaissance Europe, the Scythians could stand for noble savagery, for the origins of particular peoples, or for a distant, feral past. Travelers' tales and national myths sometimes claimed descent from Scythian stock, weaving ancient nomads into the fabric of modern identities. By the 19th century, archaeologists and imperial curation turned Scythian gold into symbols of nationhood, often reading modern narratives back into ancient objects. In the modern era, national histories in Eastern Europe and Asia sometimes appropriate Scythian heritage to legitimate contemporary states or to claim deep roots in contested lands. Museums display recovered treasure as proof of ancient occupation, and nationalist historians frame Scythians as ancestors of modern nations, simplifying complex processes of cultural blending into narratives of continuity. Such uses reveal as much about modern politics as they do about the past, reminding us that archaeology and history are often mobilized in the service of present concerns. Scientific advances have helped complicate older narratives, and methods from archaeology to genetics have redrawn parts of the map. Ancient DNA studies over the past decade have shown that steppe populations were fluid and composite, that migrations could be massive, but also that local continuities existed. Genetic signatures once thought to define a single people now reveal networks of relatedness across time and space, where Scythian graves contain mixtures of ancestries. These findings nudge us away from tidy ethnic boxes and toward a more nuanced appreciation of how identities form through contact, marriage, and migration. The dissemination of Scythian artistic forms into Europe and Asia points to a cultural portability that is a kind of legacy in itself. Motifs that began on the steppe appear in Scythian-style ornaments far from their points of origin, carried by traders and trophies, by craftsmen migrating in search of patronage, and by local elites hungry for prestige. The animal style that typifies Scythian work influenced Celtic metalwork in Europe and various steppe artisans to the east, creating a visual thread across continents. Artworks thus served as vectors of cultural memory long after the people who made them had been absorbed into new formations. The Scythians' reputation for horsemanship and archery shaped the image of nomad warfare for centuries. Later steppe powers learned from their example and adapted their practices, refining mounted archery tactics and logistics for sustained campaigns. The Mongols would later perfect some of these techniques, but the lineage of mobility and tactical flexibility traces back through a long lineage of steppe innovations, of which the Scythians were an influential chapter. Even when political forms faltered, military ideas continued, passed down by experience and imitation. Roman writers, encountering successor peoples of the steppe, sometimes recycled Scythian stereotypes, projecting ancient images onto new opponents. In doing so, they created a literary continuity that blurred historical specifics, treating Scythian as a catch-all for steppe barbarians in the Roman imagination. This flattening obscured the deep diversity among steppe groups but cemented certain traits, ferocity, mobility, exotic dress, into the European imagination. Those images would travel into medieval chronicles and Renaissance art, preserving a distorted but persistent Scythian presence in European cultural memory. Economically, the transition from raiding to trade changed how steppe elites accrued wealth and power, a shift that affected the Scythians and their successors. Trade required stable relations, safe routes, and the willingness to engage in repeated exchanges, which in turn encouraged diplomatic ties, hostages, and marriage alliances. The transformation from a predominantly extractive economy to one more embedded in long-distance commerce could dilute the position of raiding elites and empower merchant classes and sedentary allies. Over time, such shifts reshape social hierarchies, altering who holds power and how it is expressed. The archaeology of fortifications and settlements in areas once dominated by Scythians shows a growing interest in fixed places that contrasts with earlier mobility. In Crimea and along rivers like the Dnieper, sites that began as seasonal hubs sometimes became year-round centers of administration and trade. The presence of coins, standardized weights, and imported pottery indicates integration into broader economic systems. For nomads, the decision to invest in a fixed center carries long-term implications for mobility, military readiness, and cultural exchange. Burial continuity and discontinuity provides a particularly vivid picture of gradual assimilation. In some regions, Scythian burial rites continued for generations even as other markers of identity changed. In other regions, kurgans disappeared, replaced by different mortuary forms that signaled new beliefs or new ruling elites. These patterns reflect a landscape in which tradition and innovation coexisted, where old practices could be retained in ceremonial life even as daily life shifted in other directions. Scythian textiles and clothing, preserved in certain tombs, reveal an elegance and technical skill that challenge stereotypes of primitive nomads. Felt work, woven fabrics, and intricate patterns demonstrate artisanship adapted to nomadic life, designed for warmth and portability while embodying aesthetic values. The visual language of costume, cut, color, and adornment helped mark clan, status, and affiliation, and as those clothes traveled, so did meanings. When new groups adopted Scythian dress elements, they also took on fragments of the Scythian social world. Mummified remains with tattoos and body decoration invite questions about personal identity that go beyond politics and warfare. Tattoos may have signified rank, bravery, fertility, or spiritual protection, and their specific motifs connect individuals to broader mythic themes. As Scythian populations mixed with neighbors, these practices might have been retained, abandoned, or transformed into new forms of bodily expression. The archaeology of the body thus becomes a living archive, storing the intimate details of past lives. The steppe psychology shaped Scythian faith and practice in ways that survived their political decline. Seasonal migrations, the centrality of horses, and the omnipresence of predators and herds all informed religious metaphors and ritual acts. Even when new rulers took over territories, they often had to reckon with the steppe's constraints and possibilities, inheriting spiritual logics about land use, rites of passage, and the management of herds. These inherited ecologies anchored cultural elements that continued to structure life across successive societies. The idea of Scythian women as warrior figures fed ancient myth and modern fascination, and archaeology complicates and enriches that picture. Arms in women's graves, equestrian gear, and accounts from neighboring peoples suggest a more fluid social spectrum where women could, on occasion, occupy martial roles. Whether this amounted to a systemic institution of female warriors or to notable exceptions is still debated, but either way the evidence disrupts simple assumptions about gender in ancient Eurasia. Such complexity matters because it invites us to think of the past in its own terms rather than through contemporary stereotypes. As the Scythians waned, their interactions with the Greek world left a reciprocal imprint on Hellenic art and myth. Greek craftsmen who made Scythian-style objects, and Greek authors who wrote about Scythian customs helped create a hybrid cultural zone along the Black Sea. In that liminal space, merchants, artisans, and princes negotiated identities that were neither purely Greek nor purely Scythian but a lived mixture. These zones of contact became crucibles of cultural innovation, producing new forms that later peoples would inherit. The Scythians also participated in the long movements of ideas that would become the Silk Road's antecedents, helping to transport goods and motifs between China and the Mediterranean long before the network crystallized under imperial sponsorship. Horse breeds, metalworking techniques, and decorative styles moved vast distances across Eurasia, and nomads were often the carriers of such exchange. In this respect, the Scythians were part of a broader web that knit distant regions together economically and culturally, and their decline did not sever those connections so much as reroute and reconfigure them. The transition to Sarmatian dominance did not erase Scythian memory overnight. Sarmatian elites often adopted Scythian customs and sought legitimacy through association with the past, preserving certain burial practices and artistic motifs. In this way, the successor culture maintained a thread of continuity even as its political identity differed. Over time that continuity frayed further, yet it showed how cultural legacies can persist beneath the surface of political change. In later antiquity and the early medieval period, the nomadic world continued to shift, with new horses and new riders entering the stage, most famously the Huns. The Huns and later groups learned from the steppe centuries of mounted warfare, including tactics that the Scythians had helped to refine. Thus, The Scythians influenced military developments long after their political presence faded, their lessons encoded in the strategies of later cavalry. The lineage from Scythian to Sarmatian to Hunnic to Turkic and Mongol practices forms a complex chain of adaptation and reinvention. The literary footprint of the Scythians remains deep because their image answered ancient questions about civilization and savagery, mobility and settlement. They provided a foil against which Greeks could define themselves, a living contrast that illuminated the possibilities and dangers of life beyond city walls. This literary role helped preserve a certain image even as the archaeological record told a different, more nuanced story. When readers in later eras encountered tales of Scythian kings or Amazons, they met a constructed past as much as a recovered one. Museums and collections which display Scythian artifacts help keep their legacy alive, but they also raise ethical questions about the removal of cultural property and the politics of display. Objects taken in imperial expeditions or purchased under dubious circumstances complicate narratives about heritage and ownership. Modern debates about repatriation and the responsibilities of curators underline how the past remains entangled with present power. The gold on a plinth carries not only ancient skill but modern dilemmas about who speaks for the dead. Archaeologists continue to refine dating methods and to excavate new sites, bringing fresh data to debates about the Scythians' decline. Radiocarbon dating, stratigraphic analysis, and the careful study of pollen and animal remains open windows into the environmental and economic contexts that shaped outcomes. Each new kurgan uncovered or reanalyzed can revise chronologies and challenge long-standing assumptions. In this way, the past is not fixed but continually reinterpreted through new evidence and fresh perspectives. Modern historians are cautious about monocausal explanations. They prefer multicausal narratives that weave together ecology, economy, technology, and human agency. The Scythians' decline fits such a pattern. No single enemy felled them, no single drought ended them, but a converging set of forces nudged them into new forms. Such complexity does not make the story less interesting, it makes it truer to human realities, where choices and chance continually intersect. Long-term legacies are often intangible, expressed in techniques, tales, and tastes rather than in direct legal continuities. The Scythians' art, horsemanship, and steppe techniques survived in modified forms, shaping the cultures that followed them. Their name persisted in classical literature and medieval chronicles, offering Europeans a shorthand for the mysterious North. And in the steppes themselves, the memory of elite kurgans and sacrificial rites lingered in the practices of successor peoples who claimed lineage or simply borrowed successful customs. Identity on the steppe was a practice as much as a birthright, a set of behaviors and symbols performed in public and private life. When Scythian elites shifted their behavior, if they adopted sedentary rule, if they took Roman coin, if they married into Hellenistic dynasties, they changed the practice of identity. Gradually, those practices produced new names and new social formations, and the label Scythian became less useful to people living in transformed circumstances. Names change, and with them the stories people tell about themselves. In the way their graves have been read and misread, the Scythians teach us about the limits of historical imagination. Early excavators romanticized them as noble barbarians, and later nationalists claimed them as direct ancestors. Each interpretation reflected the concerns of its time as much as the facts on the ground. Today, scholars must sift through layers of prejudice and projection to reconstruct lives that are always partly lost to us, piecing together a mosaic from shards. The material remains of the Scythians continue to captivate because they are tangible evidence of a life lived at the intersection of mobility and artistry. Gold that survived centuries underground now glints under museum lights, and felt and leather speak to techniques adapted to the environment. These objects invite listeners to imagine hands shaping metal, spindles turning wool, and riders urging horses across plains. Even absent living voices, these artifacts are eloquent witnesses to human creativity. Another aspect of legacy is ecological knowledge passed down and pastoral practices that other groups adopted when they moved into former Scythian territories. Seasonal grazing patterns, water management, and herd breeding strategies are forms of expertise that often persist through population change. Successor peoples who learned how to negotiate rivers, marshes, and steppe microclimates had an advantage in establishing control and sustaining livelihoods. Thus, the Scythians' imprint on landscape use outlived their political dominance and shaped later economies. The Scythians' interface with the sedentary world left legal and social traces as well. Treaties, marriages, and trade agreements show that relations were not purely predatory but institutionalized in many ways. Some Scythian leaders entered diplomatic relations with Greek cities, accepting ambassadors and negotiating terms of exchange. Those interactions required a vocabulary of promises and obligations that resembled early statecraft, even as the underlying social structures remained nomadic. When such practices evolved, they created precedents for future diplomacy between steppe and city. The romanticization of the Scythians in modern culture sometimes hinders sober analysis, but it also keeps popular interest alive and open to correction by scholarship. Novels, films, and documentaries often borrow images of Scythian gold or fierce horseback archers because they make irresistible dramatic material. Scholars can use that fascination as an opportunity for public education, correcting myths and offering a richer view of the past. This exchange between popular imagination and academic scrutiny continues to shape how the Scythians are perceived in the 21st century. Regional studies of Scythian presence reveal a mosaic of local outcomes rather than a single pattern of decline. In the Pontic steppe their decline took one shape, in the Altai another, and in the western fringes yet another. Local geography, neighboring powers, and internal social structures all mediate what continuity or change looks like. This patchwork emphasizes the danger of grand narratives that flatten difference in favor of simplicity. Scythian influence on material culture in Eastern Europe played into the emergence of later political forms, not as direct elections but as distant inspirations. The display cultures of medieval princes, the emphasis on mounted elites, and certain ritual patterns can be traced to deeper steppe traditions where Scythian practices were one link in a long chain. These are not lineages of blood so much as chains of imitation and functional continuity. Over centuries, behaviors that solve similar problems reappear in new guises. Modern archaeological ethics also complicate the way we handle Scythian heritage, calling for collaboration with descendant communities and regional stakeholders. This approach challenges older extractive models of research and display, pushing museums and universities to share narratives and to respect local claims. Collaborative projects can transform collections from trophies into shared dialogues, inviting communities to participate in the telling of their pasts. In doing so, they reshape the social legacy of ancient peoples in contemporary worlds. The decline of the Scythians ultimately teaches a larger lesson about the impermanence of dominance and the resilience of culture. Political power can fade quickly, but ideas, forms of expertise, and aesthetic tastes often survive in transformed ways. The Scythians lost their hegemonic position on the steppe, yet their artistic idioms, burial rites, and equestrian practices reverberated across time. Their story is neither a tragedy of disappearance nor a simple triumph of continuity, but a complex metamorphosis that leaves traces in unexpected places. In the field today, archaeologists and historians argue and revise, and each new discovery can reroute the conversation, reminding us that history is an ongoing conversation. The Scythians are not a closed chapter but a subject whose outlines continue to sharpen with each excavation and each analysis. As we learn more about ancient DNA, climate patterns, and trade networks, the narrative becomes richer and more intricate. That richness honors the complexity of the people themselves, whose lives intersected with forces as large as the continents they rode across. Finally, the practical legacy of the Scythians lives on in the rhythms of steppe life that persist in Central Asia and Eastern Europe, in horse breeding practices, and in a visual vocabulary that still excites artists and archaeologists. The idea of the Scythian survives as both a historical subject and a cultural touchstone, reminding us that the past is entangled with the present. In their decline they became, paradoxically, one of the steppe's most enduring presences, a source of motifs, techniques, and stories that continue to shape how we imagine mobility, power, and artistry on the vast Eurasian plains. Their graves may be silent, but those dead still speak through objects and landscapes, urging us to listen carefully to the interplay of human decision and natural constraint. The story of decline is not only about endings but about the persistence of certain human solutions, craftsmanship, horsemanship, and social display that adapt to new circumstances. Whether under a Scythian sky or the sky of those who followed, people have continued to negotiate the same ecological and social challenges with creativity. In that continuity there is both loss and survival, an echo across centuries that keeps the Scythians present in the long history of the Eurasian steppe. To drive through the modern lands the Scythians once roamed is to see a living palimpsest, highways cut through ancient routes, farmsteads grow where herds once grazed, and cities rise like islands of permanence in a sea that was once open. Yet in that landscape the past remains legible to those who look, mounds that mark graves, scattered artifacts in plowed fields, and place names that preserve ancient echoes. The decline of the Scythians altered the human geography of those lands, but it did not erase the imprints they left behind. Those imprints continue to instruct and to enchant. When we think about legacy, we tend to imagine monuments or laws, but the Scythians teach us to look for subtler continuities, taste, technique, and tactical thinking passed along by people who borrowed, adapted, and survived. Their decline was not an extinction but a transformation, and in that transformation they contributed to the genetic, cultural, and artistic heritage of vast regions. The steppe story is a braided one, and the Scythians are one of its most luminous strands, even as the braid shifted and reformed through time. Listening to their traces is like following a river backward into its tributaries. Each turn reveals new connections and new reasons for change. The archaeological record, the ancient texts, and modern scientific methods each provide pieces of a large puzzle, and together they offer a picture that is never complete but always compelling. The lesson is that decline can be a doorway into other kinds of survival, and that legacies are often dispersed in practice rather than preserved in single monuments. The Scythians live on in the shapes of art, in horsemanship, and in the cultural DNA of the steppe. So the decline of the Scythians should be understood not as a closing chapter but as a reshaping of influence, a migration of ideas into new vessels and new names. Their descendants, their heirs, and their neighbors carried forward elements of Scythian life into medieval and modern times, integrating them into hybrid cultures that answered different demands. This process is continuous and dynamic, a reminder that cultures do not vanish so much as morph, leaving fingerprints that careful study can still detect. The legacy of the Scythians endures where people least expect it, in a decorative curve on a belt, in the rout of a herd, and a strategy remembered by later cavalry. In the end, the story of decline and legacy asks us to consider how we remember the past and what we choose to preserve. The Scythians' decline was real and consequential, but their legacy is alive in manifold ways that matter to historians, archaeologists, and the many peoples descended from or living on the lands they once traversed. The Kurgans remain testaments to ambition and artistry, and their art continues to move us with its elegance and force. From graves and gold to horses and stories, the Scythians continue to speak across the ages, reminding us that every ending in history is also a threshold to a new form of life.